if you're happy to do that, that's fine. Okay, off you go, Carrie.
Fabulous. Okay, morning everybody. I'm going to talk about the Palance motif this morning. When I first started thinking about this, I recalled a day a couple of years ago where I was lucky enough to go and listen to Margaret Atwood speak. I was horrifically giddy about it as a woman who probably should know better than getting as excited as I did, but here I was, and I was sat there with my original copy of the Handmaid's Tale from when I was a student at Leeds University, and was really taken by the idea that actually inside my book was my maiden name, with my details of my course when I was at university. And I thought about all the changes I've gone through in the times I've read it multiple times, and taught it now as a teacher. And that started to resonate with some of the things I'm going to talk about today, about things that we keep and things that change. So in the first chapter of Handmaids, we first get the mention of this word palimpsest. It was probably a word when I first read, and then several readings after, that I would have just passed over and ignored actually. But multiple readings and teachings have come back to make me realise how important it is as an idea. Offred says to us, dances would have been held there, the music lingered, a palimpsest of unheard sound. We get this sense immediately that we're somewhere alien, and that Offred's discomforted by that, but equally there are elements of the familiar, and we get this sense of the paradox of sound still remaining even though it can't be heard, which starts to really raise the importance of this motif of voices being able to come back. And that's really kind of the key intention behind the Handmaid's Tale, of being able to share stories that someone's trying to suppress. If you think about one of the most famous, arguably, dystopian fictions of all time, George Orwell's 1984, interestingly, the word palimpsest also occurs there, where Orwell talks about history being a palimpsest, scraped clean and reinscribed exactly as often was necessary. And the more sinister connotations of that start to become clear to us. This idea that we can wipe history away and put down what was deemed necessary, and we start to get this connection with sense of status and power, and whose stories get heard and how stories get told, which obviously is so integral to the Handmaid's Tale, which is why I've become so interested in this idea. So for those of you like me, when I first read it, that didn't know what a palimpsest was, it's a manuscript or piece of writing material on which later writing's been superimposed, or which has effaced earlier writing, and it's something that's reused or altered but still bears its visible traces. And I think that's the definition that really interests me and that I'm going to focus on as we go through the talk this morning. A key quote that comes to me from the text to think about this idea is the prayers. You know, we know that Gilead is a theocracy, and Offred comments on the fact that the prayers in the soul scrolls have been printed out and they've been said, but then the paper rolls back through these machines and is recycled into fresh paper again. Freshness is often, got connotations of newness and positivity, but here we get this satirical purpose of these prayers coming through and then being wiped away and going back through almost like a machine, a production line of praying becoming quite impersonal. So is it useful to think about Handmaid's Tale as a palimpsestic text? We know we've got the intertextual, the cultural, the historical allusions, and I'm not going to focus too much on that this morning because I know that's getting picked up later in some of the other talks. What I'm going to focus more on are the different layers of voices that come throughout the text, and the intermingling of the narrative threads and the overlapping of temporal lines. So I'm going to focus more on the methodology that Atwood uses that links to this motif. The choices right from the beginning of Offred's story are really clear, that we've got some sense that something has happened before, something has been reproduced here. She talks about the light fitting being plastered over, the banister that was once a tree, the time that was measured by bells as once in nunneries. The Rita's dress is dull green, and the interesting use of a simile that like a surgeon's gown of the time before. Making that connection between jobs that now aren't allowed. The conduplication, that repetition of in the time before, you know, if you had the time to go through and count how many times that happens in the text, it's many in one form or another. We're constantly reminded that things weren't always like this. And Offred increasingly notices that there are elements of life remaining. There's still a black market. The woman in front of me was Serena Joy, or had been once. You know, this change in identity that's happened. The street's almost like a museum. You know, we get a sense that some things have been kept exactly as they were because they weren't deemed as offensive as other things. You can see the place under the lily where the lettering was painted out, and a huge part of this is going to be about language and about the access to language that we're allowed. The wall that becomes this huge central motif is hundreds of years old too. It's been there forever, seemingly, but is now a different symbol and used for a very different purpose. So it's immediately obvious in the tale that's been told to us that there are things that remain, and that becomes a real symbol of empowerment, that Offred is able to remember these things that she's not supposed to remember. The narrative levels themselves can be seen as palimpsestic. You know, the handmaid is replaceable, going back to the plaster being plastered over and the words that Offred finds in the wardrobe. We know that there's been a previous Offred. You know, she's a patronymic, her name has been taken away, and Offred is simply whoever is of Freds. Very sinisterly, when Offglen disappears, we get another person who just declares, I am Offglen. You know, in a really sinister kind of sense that these women are replaceable. Although it's a homodiegetic narrative, although we get Offred's voice exclusively throughout until the epilogue, we're really dependent on Offred to be a reliable witness, and her text becomes quite openly palimpsestic in that she is providing other people's voices. She provides Serena Joy's voice, she provides the commander's voice, she provides Moira's voice, her mother's voice, and not always in a reliable way. And that's really apparent throughout the text. And the question starts to be raised is why her? Why does she get to tell the story? What effect would it have if someone else was telling the story? Those of you that have read the Testaments, you know, that might be something really interesting to think about in terms of whose stories we then get at a later point. And it really highlights the unreliability of stories, which I think is a key point that Atwood is trying to make. You know, we have to question our sources. We have to question how people's stories are being changed or being suppressed. You know, but she also highlights on a more positive note the necessity of stories for survival and for making sense of our lives and of our situations that we're in. For Offred, being able to tell a story becomes a sense of I'm here, I'm alive, I'm surviving. The epilogue there, the extra diegetic level, debatedly, goes even further to show that we've abstracted the story. It's gone through lots and lots of different versions before reaching us. We don't know if it's in the right order. And it really highlights the historical parallels that have been replicated and subverted. There have been allusions throughout the text, but they're really made quite clear to us how much of actual history has been put into the text. And a lot of this palimpsestic nature actually links to what genre Handmaid's Tale actually is. You know, Margaret Atwood has spoken about it being speculative fiction, but we know it draws on that history of dystopian fiction, as I alluded to with Orwell. And a dystopia, we know, is a society that's failed in its duty to its people. It's an unpleasant place. It's a place we fear as readers reading of future dystopia. But it is built out of the idea of a utopia, Plato's and Thomas More, which literally means no place, but is a society of perfection with no strife. But something I think that dystopian writers and Atwood certainly is thinking about with the idea of utopia. We know Gilead has been put as a place of healing. You know, the name Gilead itself is drawn on that idea of healing and the balm of Gilead from the Bible. But the idea here is that this place that would be deemed as utopian, perhaps by the engineers of Gilead, is actually a place that we deem to be horrific, and other versions of utopias will equally have been deemed as horrific by a different audience, a future audience. And Atwood has referred to that utopia, a society where elements of dystopia and utopia merge. As the commander says in the text, better always means worse for some. And in the epilogue, we get a mention, you know, a real recognition that this is a palimpsestic text, and any version, perhaps, of society is. No new system can impose itself upon a previous one without incorporating many of the elements to be found in the latter. You know, it's almost impossible, arguably, to have a society that doesn't draw on a previous one. And even though Gilead has you know, made out that it's created this new society, there are clearly things that remain from the society before. A useful term to think about in terms of genre is Linda Hutchins' definition of historiographic metafiction. It's well worth looking into. I'm not going to dwell on it now because we need a lot longer. But postmodern texts like Atwood's text often openly assert that there are only truths in the plural and never one truth. And I think the style of the Handmaid's Tale is really highlighting that. You know, despite the fact that we do have this homodiegetic narrative, this one person's story, you know, we know that we could have had any handmaid telling us this story, and different versions would be represented to us. It would certainly be different, as I said before, if Serena Joy was telling us the story. And it's really highlighted to us when we get to the end, obviously, about the way that one person's truth can be seen as subjective or seen as different for other people. And the metafiction side of it, the openly self-reflexive narrative that is happening with Offred is really quite keenly linked to that idea of historiographic metafiction, this merging of historical fiction and metafiction is a really interesting methodology to unpick. And a big question we can ask ourselves is who the narrative voice belongs to. As we're hearing Offred, you know, she's clearly a flawed narrator, and I think that's a purposeful choice. But we get to see her recognising this palimpsestic nature. She makes comments like, I don't know when they stopped having the festival, I didn't notice. And I think we're judging her almost as a reader post this novel of thinking, why didn't you notice? But actually starting to question whether we notice things that are happening. You know, Atwood has always talked about the fact that there's nothing in the text that couldn't happen or that hasn't already happened. You know, Offred comments, it's taken so little time to change our minds about things like these. You know, she moves from mocking her mother's radical feminism to actually realising that she's allowed, as a group of women post second wave feminism, to maybe not notice that things were starting to change. And it's obviously done in a very hyperbolic way in The Handmaid's Tale, arguably, but the speed at which it happened and the fact that people didn't notice it happening is really key. She talks about the you know, falsification or the subversion of history. Who knows if any of it's true? It could be old clips, it could be faked. You know, I think this has become scarily important to an audience post writing of the text now. This idea of what we know is, you know, what is fake news. I guess that's how they were able to do it. There wasn't even any rioting in the streets. You know, is there an authorial voice here asking us to question what we accept, what we allow to happen? These bodies hanging on the wall are time travelers, anachronisms. They've come here from the past. You know, things that how quickly can things become deemed as unacceptable depending on who has the power. And I think probably one of the most sinister quotes in the text, ordinary, says Aunt Lydia, is what you're used to. This may not seem ordinary to you now, but after time it will become ordinary. You know, really quite a scary comment. I'm sure everyone would agree. Now, structurally, I think this is where we can really capitalise on this motif. So we start the text with dedications, and I always, when I'm teaching this text, I always ask the students to consider the dedications as a structural device. We start with the dedication to Mary Webster, who, you know, is allegedly an ancestor of Margaret Atwood's. And you know, you can look into the story for yourself, but apparently was someone who was tried for being a witch, but didn't die and survived. And a quote that I love of Margaret Atwood is, "If there's one thing I hope I've inherited from her, it's her neck." You know, and this idea of women who are deemed to be other, who are deemed to be not acceptable, surviving to tell their stories, I think is a really key way to begin the novel, even before the story is told. You know, consider the salvaging with that dedication in mind. It puts a whole new light on it, doesn't it? You know, the fact that Moira there's a tiny reference in the book, but the more times you read it, the more you see these little allusions. She gets off the female road, again, a palimpsestic idea from the Underground Railroad of slavery, gets off at Salem. You know, and obviously the location of Offred's story is really key and linked to that Puritan history. She also dedicates the book to Perry Miller, one of her professors. You know, and it's very interesting, is it not, that we have a male we have a historian here who is with the responsibility of telling the story of this Puritan history. So juxtaposing those two in the dedications is a really interesting decision, particularly when we get to the professor story at the end of the text. The epigraphs as well, you know, absolutely need to be considered as part of Atwood's methodology. They create, in my opinion, an ironic frame for the novel. We get the idea of the Genesis epigraph, and I think it really raises, and I've heard Margaret Atwood in interviews talking about the idea of antinomian heresy, you know, the idea that we can actually use religion to justify things that wouldn't be deemed okay in a society. And that Genesis text has been taken and recontextualized to take away the anguished plea of a woman who wants children and believes she should have children, and it recontextualizes it and reads it literally to really justify state-sanctioned rape in the text. And there are other examples there of that antinomian heresy that takes biblical text literally, and you know, as Offred says, the scriptural precedent. Blessed be the meek, you know, the quotes from Aunt Lydia that are used to really subvert some messages and to change them for the ends of the power in the society. Likewise, the modest proposal epigraph is really important. You know, I could talk about this for ages, but Swift's modest proposal is clearly satirical. You know, it's written in response to an issue, the Irish famine, and that is what Gilead is. Gilead is set up in response to a problem of fertility, something that mirrored a problem that was actually happening in society at the time that it was written, and it sets up this satirical intention, you know, that you can come up with ridiculous proposals to sort out a problem. And I think that sets up that idea that we need to read this text and read Gilead's ideas and think about some of the proposals that come up to deal with situations and how they might be really quite harmful in the wrong hands. And again, something else that's raised is the Sufi epigraph, which I think sometimes is neglected. And I'd highly recommend that you go off and look at the links between the text and Sufism. It's fascinating. Again, I haven't got time to talk about it here this morning, but something I would like to raise is that it does start to think about that issue of spirituality. And you know, we're in a theocracy which we can consider as harmful in the text, but actually what happens in the night sections of the text is really interesting. Structurally, there are 7, which again, I might be being a typical English teacher here and over-analysing, but I think that 7 sections, when we connect with the Genesis idea, raises some interesting questions about why there are 7 sections. The analectic shifts of Offred's really demonstrate her sense of power. It shows her sense that she can still remember, that she still has elements of her previous self, that she will survive. It links back to the idea of Sufism, which is a really personal faith. It's a deliberate meditation, a deliberate reflection. You know, so instead of this state-controlled religion that's been enforced, she actually gets some sense of choice. She asks the question in the opening chapter, where should I go? And then chooses where to go in her mind in the nighttime. And I think Atwood is raising there, through that link to Sufism, some sense of the control we have over our own beliefs and our own faith. It's very interesting, is it not, that the faith cushion is the cushion that's left in the room, which links to that sense of almost her being told, even though most things have been stripped from the room and that she's not supposed to read, actually the word that she does get left with is the faith cushion. And we could take that as a sense of control, that she has to have faith in Gilead, but equally could we not read that as a sense of her own personal choice, her own personal faith that she chooses. You know, and Offred through this really realises the importance of her story. I'm always really intrigued by the fact that Atwood chose our narrator as a librarian in a previous life, who at the point of the revolution happening was transferring books to disc, which in itself is a very small little palimpsestic idea, but Offred keeps the books and takes the books away, and I think there's some foreshadowing there of the importance of language, the importance of that in power, which we see when Offred has this really exaggerated sort of sexual response almost to the Scrabble game later on, this importance of words, which we don't realise until they're taken away. And, you know, really key, coming to the end now, really key stylistic feature of the tale is this idea of these layers of textual material. You know, and it's been commented by many critics about the idea that the novel constantly reiterates that problematic relationship, that idea that there's one single reality, one truthful history, which I think is what's so integral to this motif. Offred multiple quotes I could have given you, talks about that navigation throughout her story, you know, creating stories for Luke, who is missing, but going back and trying to find the truth in her story. And she says, I wander back, try to regain those distant pathways. And lots of this goes back to that idea that actually, you know, women's histories have often been seen as hysterical. You know, very quickly, you can think quite usefully about the history of hysteria, and particularly men's versions of hysteria. If we think about Freud and this idea of what he deemed hysteria to be in his teachings, that linked to the theory of, you know, basically women have penis envy. We get this cure for penis envy being marriage, birth, or uterine massage, all elements which are being connected to the story of Handmaid's Tale and satirised by Atwood in terms of, you know, women will get over their hysteria if they're married off, or if they have children, or if they're, let's put it bluntly in the story, if they're raped and controlled through sex. But the motif I want to carry away from this as I come to an end here is that the way Margaret Atwood picks up that idea of penis envy and satirises it. She talks about pen is envy. I envy the commander, his pen. You know, she plays with words, plays with language, introduces the paronomasia, which really takes us to this idea of moving from this hysteria that women have been painted as when they tell their stories, when they make their voices heard, and move into this concept of her story. You know, the importance of women's point of view being told and history being written from a female perspective as well as from the male. And I always come back to this quote here. There is something subversive about this garden of Serena's, a sense of buried things bursting upwards wordlessly into the light, you know, going back to that unheard sound at the beginning, as if to say whatever is silenced will clamour to be heard, though silently. And this is the point of the tale, isn't it? That actually, when we get to the epilogue at the end, you know, we get this sense that we're not supposed to censure what's happened to this woman. Her story is invalidated. We're supposed to understand there was still these sexist language and sexist jokes being made. Nothing much has changed, despite the pain in the story. But Atwood gives us that lovely, subtle use of paronomasia, the little clue there at the end, that the lecture is being given in Dene, none of it. You know, if you say it enough times, you hear it, don't you? Deny none of it. Don't let history be told and deny her story. As Offred herself has said, you know, nothing changes instantaneously. In a gradually heating bathtub, you'd be boiled to death before you knew it. We were the people who were not in the papers. We need to remember that we need to be mindful of how things are changing, take control of our narrative. And to end there, the very last sentence always sticks in my head of the book. Are there any questions? You know, when we get to the epilogue, we get quite a worrying idea of how history can be subverted, a real recognition. If we haven't picked up on the palimpsestic signs throughout the text, we get a reminder there that actually our stories can be changed and controlled. So the importance of noticing those changes and having a voice is really clearly being made. Right, I need to stop. I think my time is over. I hope that's given you some interesting ideas to think about. And I know there'll be connections with some of the talks coming up. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry. That was absolutely brilliant. Obviously, your knowledge of the text and the subject under discussion is, is absolutely fabulous. As Elaine, I can certainly hear
that
you.
Is happening. Yeah.
I can't see you at the minute, but I think that's all right. But we can hear you, which is the important thing, and we can see your screen as well.
Yeah.
So Heidi, are you going to hit record again for this bit?
That's done.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Off you go, Elaine.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. My name is Elaine McNally, and I've chosen to talk to you today about a piece of feminist criticism called Laugh of the Medusa by Helen Sixu. And I just think Kerry's talk was amazing, because hopefully some of the things that she talked about, I'm actually going to pick up in this talk and illuminate them as well. So I do also appreciate that you don't have this essay in front of you, but hopefully I can make enough of Sixu's arguments clear so that you can get something useful from this. And it is really easy to find it online. So I thought I'd start by just talking about why I like to share this with my students, why I think they benefit from knowing about this essay. So Sixu uses the phrase Equator Feminine, or women's writing, to describe texts that deviate from traditionally masculine styles of writing. So straight away it gives us a way of looking at Offred's oral narrative in comparison to the text that it has become after Picciotto has rearranged it. So in her essay, she's concerned with structural differences between masculine and feminine texts. She talks about how those texts, women's texts, have been marginalized. And she argues really powerfully that women should reclaim their bodies and voices in order to sort of subvert patriarchal silencing. So I particularly like this essay because firstly, Atwood to me seems to be really drawing, quite significantly influenced by this theory. I think it gives students a way into considering the how of writing rather than the what, which I think gives them a way of talking about form, structure, and style. It's always good to look through different critical lenses. And finally, I really want them to understand that the craft of storytelling and writing are not neutral acts. I think that gives them a more nuanced way into the text. So I'm going to look at 4 areas: the way in which Sixu reimagines the Medusa, the significance of laughter, the idea of a feminine text and practice of writing, and the motif of the matrix, and hopefully connect all these things to the idea of Equator Feminine and the Handmaid's Tale. So I thought it would be worth actually just clarifying why it's called Laugh of the Medusa. And Kerry talked about Freud and the idea of penis envy. So that's exactly where we are with Sixu. So when she calls it Laugh of the Medusa, because she's referring to psychoanalytic theory, specifically the idea that the decapitation of the Medusa correlates to male fear of castration. Yeah. So Atwood satirizes these Freudian links between power and the phallus, Offred says, obviously, pen is envy, and Moira, the radical feminist, makes a really perceptive connection to that image of the Medusa when she says to men, women are exotic monsters. So Sixu takes the Medusa that we get given in Freud, and she reimagines her. And she reimagines her as a source of female strength and beauty. Yeah, there we go. Reimagines the Medusa as a source of female strength and beauty. And she asks, wouldn't the worst be in truth that women aren't castrated? And she states, and I think this is like my favourite bit in the whole essay, when she says, you only have to look at the Medusa straight on to see her. And she's not deadly, she's beautiful, and she's laughing. So there's that correlation between the idea of Medusa and laughter, and specifically a correlation between laughter and defiance. And I think when we understand how Cixous presents the unruly power of female laughter, we've got a way of talking about how laughter in The Handmaid's Tale can be radically subversive. It is a novel in which there are surprisingly many moments of humour and many moments of actual laughter, but I picked this one to have a look at. So in this quotation, Offred is reflecting on the absurdity of what has happened in the commander's study. And she talks about her laughter in a series of explosive images. And she says, the laughter is boiling like lava in my throat. And we can see the tumult in her body with those verbs, shake, heave, burst, and that metaphor of the volcano, lava, seismic, volcanic. And then if we look at what Cixous has to say about laughter, she says, a feminine text is volcanic, laughs exude from our mouths. So we've got the same language, the same imagery, and those kind of parallels are really clear. So why is it important to know this? First of all, I think for me, it's what Offred is doing is enacting the protest and resistance that Cixous claims for female texts. And also, I want to give students a way of talking about how Offred refuses to be a victim. And I think Cixous' arguments about laughter give them a way to do that, because laughter in Cixous' essay is a really specifically female challenge to masculine hegemonic structures.
Hi, Elaine, I'm just going to jump in. The slides haven't advanced, so could you just flick down to the slide that you're on? That would be great.
Sorry, what do you want me to do?
Can you go down to this slide that you're talking about, or are you still on that first slide?
No, I've been moving through them.
Oh, so it hasn't been advancing on our screen, but it is now.
Okay. So can you see the laughter slide?
Yes, we can. Thank you very much.
Okay, can I just clarify, if I move on, can you see the next slide?
No, we can't, but whatever you did before worked.
I just went into escape.
Yeah, and then just click the next slide. That works fine. Okay, sorry to interrupt your flow, Elaine. I'll let you get back to it. Okay, so
not quite sure what if it's going to move on. So hopefully you can see. So I've lost my point now. Right, so talking about laughter. So what I'd like to go on to do is just to give a few more definitions to the idea of what Equator Feminine might be and what masculine writing is in comparison. So I've just clicked my slide, Amy. Can you see what I've put up?
Yeah, we can see the laugh of the Medusa, feminine text and practice of writing.
And is there something under Equator Feminine now, like a column of stuff?
Yeah, laughter, challenge to male logic.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Sorry to do that. Okay, so as I've explained, laughter is specifically associated with Equator Feminine, and it is a challenge to male logic. Cixous writes about how Equator Feminine is free from the constraints of chronology, place, and narrative order. And I think we can really see that in Offred's text. She repeats often, this is a reconstruction, really drawing attention to the idea that there isn't a single version. And of course, her narrative is disorderly. The tapes were found in no particular order in the bottom of a box. According to Cixous, Equator Feminine is about gaps and spaces. It's polysemic, polyphonic. It resists endings, fixed meanings. And for me, the best example of that is what happens in chapter 18 and chapter 40. So in chapter 18, we get different versions of what may have possibly happened to Luke. And in chapter 40, which parallels that, we again get different versions of this encounter with Nick. Really, both chapters there, I think, really stress the ambiguity, the inexactitude of her text. And finally, Cixous writes a lot about the shifting and multiple aspects of Equator Feminine, and she connects that to images of boundlessness and the body and the female body. And there really is a strong connection between the text and the body in Atwood's narrative, in Atwood's story. So if that's Equator Feminine, masculine writing, in contrast, is linked to hegemonic structures and institutions. So we've got Luke, Pixiotto, the commander, who all represent patriarchal authority, and these are all men who really love studies and statistics and facts. Masculine writing in Sixou's essay is linear, chronological and closed. It's about the single point of view in which every event is kind of forced into a coherent sequence. And again, we can see that when Pixiotto criticizes the fact that many gaps remain. And gaps absolutely define Equator Feminine. Masculine writing is about fixing meanings. The commander has the word. Luke is really fussy about the meanings of things, and Pixiotto uses the language of facts and science. If Equator Feminine is all about the subjective body, then masculine writing is all about the rational mind. And if Equator Feminine operates through images of boundlessness, then masculine writing operates through images of binary, really specifically that binary between the rational male mind over the unstable female body. And for me, that's best exemplified in Pixiotto's criticism of Offred's narrative, because it's reflective. And he uses this appalling description when he says it contains a whiff of emotion. I really hate that. He basically reduces female experience down to some kind of nasty smell. But I guess what that does is underscore his irritation with a text that doesn't offer the facts that he wants. So we've thought about laughter. I've thought about some ideas to do with Equator Feminine. Let's just think about why, just to consolidate, why are these things important? Why is it worth understanding these differences? Well, as I said, I really think that Atwood is drawing on these ideas in writing her novel. For me, Offred enacts in practice those things that Sixou's essay proposes as theory. I think understanding these ideas gives students a more nuanced way of writing about gender, about writing, about female protest. But the most important thing, I think, for me is that what Equator Feminine does is it allows me to see another text underneath the one that Pixiotto has arranged. So I want to go on to think about, So when I think about Equator Feminine and masculine writing, two shapes come into my mind. So I would associate Equator Feminine with the shape of the spiral and masculine writing with the line. And I think there's a quotation in the Handmaid's Tale that really
sorry to interrupt, Elaine. Could could you click onto the slide separately again, please? Thank you.
Okay. Can you see that now?
Yes, that's great.
Okay. And if I put the quotation up, can you see that?
Yeah, women can't add.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So the quotation, I think, best sums up this difference between what Sixou defines as Equator Feminine and masculine writing is this quotation. Women can't add, says the commander. For them, 1 and 1 and 1 and 1 don't make 4. What do they make? I said, expecting 5 or 3. Just 1 and 1 and 1 and 1, he said. So for the commander, that sum represents a really linear and logical journey to an end that is fixed and has power. Okay, those parts are no longer significant. But I think if we look at this quotation through the lens of Equator Feminine, we can see something wonderfully different. That syndetic listing draws attention to those individual units, the repeated and to spaces in between, where multiple possibilities are kind of there. To me, it conjures a spiral motion where all the parts are uniquely valuable. It is the palimpsest, it is the layering of texts rather than the authority of the single version. That sum with its total stands for a linear male text, but kind of within it, constrained but straining against it, is a female text. And I just think it's brilliant. I really love that quotation, and I love the way that Atwood is sort of subverting what the commander is saying. So I've looked at laughter, I've thought about Equator Feminine. I'm just going to go on to think about the image of the matrix and why that's important. So the word matrix appears in Sixu's essay. Has my slide changed? Sorry.
No, you're going to have to do them all separately the way you did the last two. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Okay, hopefully that's all right. The word matrix appears in Sixu's essay. It appears in Offred's oral narrative. So she refers to the smell of matrix, I think in the birthday chapters. And then there's Pixie-Otto's transcript, where he, in the historical notes, talks about the obscurity of the matrix. So this word is interesting because matrix is a word in which meaning multiplies. Okay, so fixed meanings belong to patriarchy, and matrix is polysemic. It denotes mother and womb through its Latin roots. It's also a pattern of lines and spaces, maybe a network, a maze, or a labyrinth. And these are images that Sixu uses in her essay to talk about the kind of boundless and elastic nature of women. I think Sixu foregrounds the matrix because she sees women as a really extraordinary creative force. Women contain within them other women, and women contain within us other humans, and she sees us like Russian dolls, somehow generative, sort of potent, endless. Matrix is also linked to laughter in Atwood's novel. Again, when Offred is collapsing with laughter, she recognises that it is inappropriate to the occasion. The wandering womb, they used to think hysteria. And that obviously brings us back to matrix or womb through that Greek word for uterus. And then finally, matrix is a female animal. In ancient Rome, excuse me, a matrix was a female animal kept for breeding. And the Handmaid's Tale includes those demeaning associations between women and breeding animals. Oh, excuse me. So Pixie-Otto uses that phrase, the obscurity of the matrix. And he uses it to refer to those network of voices and events that are buried in history. But when he uses it, I think something really extraordinary happens to his voice and his style. So this is the point where he says it. I'll just give you a moment to read that.
Sorry, can you flick on to the next slide?
Sorry, I keep forgetting there.
Thank you.
Okay, hopefully you can see that. Oops. Yeah,
we can see it.
Okay, sorry. So when he says this, what I find so interesting about it is that his language is no longer formal or academic. In fact, what we get is metaphor. His style is quite lyrical. Sentences are multi-clausal. There's this sustained use of sibilants. And all this surrounds the reference to the matrix. So I think this is important because rather than Pixie-Otto's really smug, rational voice, what we actually get, and I think this is extraordinary, is an echo of Offred's voice from chapter 1. And I do find comparing these two quotations quite wonderful. So we have our arms and each other's hands and our grasp. We have voices, so we have the whisper and the echoes and the voices, and they move across space, across the world of the dead, in the semi-darkness, in the great darkness. I do find that really moving, actually, because in both we have the same language, the same images, the same multi-clausal sentences, the same sibilants. What I think we actually have in Pixie-Otto's conclusion to the historical notes is not his voice. It's actually Offred's overlaying the language of patriarchy. When Pixie-Otto invokes the matrix out of which they come, what I think Atwood is doing is drawing on the polysemic nature of the word matrix, and there buried but absolutely present is the female body, because it is a birth image. And I think it's extraordinary and really moving how we shift from masculine to feminine, from his story to her story. Offred's voice does reach us. Pixie Otto would have us believe that she is mute. Well, she's not. And understanding the theory of Equator Feminine, I think, allows us to see this buried text and this buried voice. It is a really remarkable aphonic rebellion, and suggests that regardless of oppression, women's voices will not be silenced. Indeed, whatever is silenced will clamour to be heard. So again, why might this be important? Well, I said at the beginning about how it really helps students to look through different critical lenses to kind of construct alternative arguments. And I'll give you an idea of how that might work. So Coral Howes says that Offred never finishes her story and her voice is almost drowned out by the voice of a male historian. Well, I think understanding the theory of Equator Feminine means that we can dispute the idea that never finishing is a flaw. In fact, the openness of the ending is a kind of challenge to academic constraint. And also, I just think that the idea that her voice is almost drowned out is really erroneous if we look at those last two quotations, because this is a book filled with female voices. It begins in whispers and ends with echoes. There is this spiral of sound. That essay is actually really worth reading, though. It's really good. And what it does do is look at some of the other arguments that Sixu raises that I haven't been able to deal with today. Okay, so just to conclude, I'm going to return to this idea of the spiral and the line as a way of thinking about Equator Feminine. So, as I said, the spiral.
Sorry, could
oh gosh,
the slide again? Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. There it is. Hopefully, yeah. Sorry about that. So, as I said, the spiral is like a feminine symbol, and links. And for me, it really embodies Equator Feminine because it resists chronology, closure, stasis, the straight lines of a traditional male narrative. And I think it's really obvious that Offred's story is not linear, despite Pixie Otto's best efforts. We start with a beginning that is no beginning because it's entirely arbitrary. It's been arranged by scholars 200 years after it has been recorded. And we've got two endings. The first ending, the darkness within or else the light, balances two equally possible outcomes. And the second ending is a question, which implies, which heralds other beginnings. So closings become openings, endings become beginnings that can spiral maybe into other possibilities. And I think if we pay attention to these possibilities, then we can hear and see another text underneath those male voices. And the whole point of Equator Feminine and of reading Sixu's essay is it allows me to access this. So, oh, hang on a minute, I've got to do this. So, how to define Equator Feminine? I thought I'd try and do that to conclude with, although in a way it goes against the spirit of what Sixu argues, because she makes it very clear that the very nature of Equator Feminine is that it resists a neat definition. But I've had a go, so I hope you don't mind that I've written this and I'm going to read it to you, but I really wanted to get it right. So this is what I would understand by Equator Feminine. At every point, the Handmaid's Tale folds back in on itself, doubling, spiraling, coiling, refusing finality. This is what Sixu means by Equator Feminine. The feminine mode of writing is fluid. It is neither sequential nor finite, but is concerned with pluralities, ambiguities, and detours, moving outside patriarchal systems. It resists fixed meanings and is shifting and unstable. Sixu and Atwood build a connection between the form and structure of the text, the radically subversive power of laughter, and the irrepressible nature of a woman's voice, and finally center these in the female body through the image of the matrix, which is a structure and a system and a source of creative beginnings, a yonic image of possibility. Okay, so that's me done. I apologize for the PowerPoint not working very well. I hope that wasn't too disruptive and awkward, but thank you very much. I enjoyed that.
Thank you very much, Elaine. That was great. I know we're all kind of battling through technology and various different situations in school this week, so we really appreciate that. And there was such a rich array of information there. I really enjoyed your interpretation of Siksu and how you applied that to the Handmaid's Tale, and also some of the resources there that I know teachers are going to be able to pick up and use with their classes as well. Okay, I'm hoping that Dr. Karina Masura is on the call. So Elaine, if you can just unshare your screen, that would be really great. And we're going to move into the question and answer session. Again, I'll just do the introduction. So we have this morning Dr. Karina Masura, who has a BA in English and American Literature, Language and Applied Linguistics, not a short degree title there, an MA in 20th Century Studies, PhD, which is focused on the work of Margaret Atwood. Karina is now a senior lecturer at Northumbria University, and she's published a range of articles on the work of Margaret Atwood. So if anyone's looking for text, critical text to share with their students or to enrich their knowledge, then I direct you towards some of Karina's work. So Karina and I are just going to have a chat about the Handmaid's Tale, about her work on it. I've got some questions which people have submitted in advance, but I've got the chat box open. So if anyone wants to add on to what we're talking about, if anyone wants to ask another question, either unmute yourself and come in, or if you don't feel confident in doing that, pop it in the chat box and I'll read it out. Okay, so Karina, we'll start off. Can you just tell us a bit about your academic research, your interest in Margaret Atwood and the Handmaid's Tale?
Yes. Can you all hear me okay? If I have any problems with connection, I might grab, this is my husband's iPad. That's why it says Simon Foster's iPad and not my name. I might move it around, try to find better connection in another room. It's been splendid so far. I was late coming in. I'm so sorry, about 10 minutes late due to my unfold. The two papers I listened to were amazing, fantastic work. I was jotting down things like crazy and sort of thinking about various things at the same time. I fell into Atwood accidentally. I was doing my master's at Newcastle University, and it's really interesting because my thesis was on Greek myth in Sylvia Plath and Denise Levertov, and I used the Eurydice and Orpheus kind of use of myth, which, you know, Joanne just made references to, and it's been used in the Handmaid's Tale. And then a friend gave me The Robber Bride by Margaret Atwood while I was doing my master's, and said, I think you like this author, she's using Greek myth too. And that's how it started, and I decided to do my PhD on Atwood, and I worked in York University with Hermione Lee, and she thought that the idea of body and language in Atwood would be a really good one. This is what I've been working on. I used feminism and psychoanalysis, and I think feminism has already been used with sort of people. Obviously, John talking about Equator Feminine. I've used Siksu, John, as well. So I know what you were talking about. And I talked a lot about female language and male language and what that means, and this idea of linear narration and cyclical narration, and how cyclical narration sometimes relates to menstruation and the woman's cycle and everything that is going on in the Handmaid's Tale. So this is all wonderful stuff, very familiar, directly related to my work. So I'm teaching the Handmaid's Tale, guys, this semester. So I was jotting down things. So every semester is a sort of new thing. The students seem to be, it's a third year module. Yeah, it's not a first year module. So by this stage, they're quite demanding, they're quite knowledgeable, they need a lot of stuff, they need a lot of theory. It's not an introductory module, it's a third year module called 21st Century Literature Writing in the Present. And that relates to one of your questions, Amy, later on, if it's still relatable.
Well, do you want to talk about that question now, actually, given that you're kind of on the topic? The question that was submitted was, it's been 35 years since the publication of The Handmaid's Tale. So is it still relevant today? So do you want to just touch on that as we're there?
Yes, I think it is. I think it's terribly relatable. And of course, I mean, you're all aware of the TV, the Hulu adaptation and the 4 seasons. And of course, only the first season is directly related to the novel. And then they've developed it after that, and they've taken it to various directions, and they made it very relatable and up to date and everything else. But even if you concentrate, I only teach, by the way, in my module, the novel and the first season. And we stop there. Otherwise, a whole module would be the Handmaid's Tale, which could very easily happen given how much material we have. But I stop there. And I was even thinking about themes in the novel, like body, language, fertility, control, the totalitarian regime. And I was thinking about second wave feminism that has been discussed already. We'll talk about that, and fourth wave feminism, and how fourth wave feminism is going on now, and everything that is happening with that, and the way women react and speak about sexual harassment, and we have movements like Me Too and Time's Up and social media, and how everything now is on social media. And usually this is a very good thing. Fourth wave feminism, mostly dated from 2010 onwards. We're going through it now. Social media is usually very good. There are problems with trolling, of course. Nothing is perfect, but this is what fourth wave feminists use, and everything is up straight away. There is something going on called everyday sexism that people, women can put stories there. So yes, I mean, this all goes back to the Handmaid's Tale. If you think about the original novel, but how the series also develops various issues. And I was looking at the Texas Heartbeat Act, and I'm sure you're aware of it, and what's going on there with the abortion rules, and how at 6 weeks, as soon as fetal heartbeat is being picked up, abortion is not allowed, is not permitted, and they've turned the rules upside down, and what women have to go through there. And if you relate that to the Handmaid's Tale, what women have to go through there, and how they're used as reproductive vessels, and I think the reference of sort of being used as breeding animals, speakers have already made references to that. It goes on and on and on. Something turns up every day. So I think it's hugely relatable and relevant, and all sorts of issues going on. I mean, some exceeding the book, like female genital mutilation, for example, that appeared, I think it was season 1, to be honest. It's an episode of season 1, as early as that, which is a huge issue. And of course, it was not addressed by the book when it was published. Fair enough, it was 1985. But yeah, I could talk about it forever. And of course, the Trump administration. And I'm sure I'm stating the obvious here. When they started shooting, they didn't know Hillary was on the run. They were hoping that Hillary would win, Hillary Clinton. And they all said it would have been a different reaction then to the novel and the season 1. But once Trump won, with thousands of women protesting, and women's rights being threatened in such a way, and they grab them by the pussy kind of discourse, if you like, that shocked everybody around the world. So yeah,
of course, it's picked up in the Testaments as well, which I've just been reading this week. This question of sexual assault and so on is developed further in that sequel. You've been talking a lot about the TV series there. Do you feel like it's true to the book? Does it develop on the book? Is it a separate work of art in itself? Is it useful for teachers to look at alongside the novel? What's your opinion on that?
I think it is very useful. I actually like it very much. I think it is very useful for teachers, and I think students like it. But of course, I always make clear what's in the book and what's in, like the female genital mutilation is not in the book. Also, what's not in the book, and I thought it was incredibly useful and relates to talks that we had this morning, amazing talks, but both speakers, is women as reproductive animals. Because when the Mexican ambassador comes in, who is a female, So it's a woman who not only is allowed to work and make a living and make money, but you know, has such a prestigious position. Often takes a while to understand that they intend to exchange them with Mexico as a reproductive, as cattle, as a reproductive force. And given the fact that they give them in the novel a tattoo, in the series they give them some sort of earring-like thing, horrific, on the sort of ears here, like they do with cows. You can really easily see the connection. But yeah, I think it's incredibly useful. I've reached season 4. Of course, you know, I follow it, you know, I have to. I'm not going to spoil it for anybody. There were moments, you know, don't worry. It's also a personal opinion. Season 1 definitely relates directly to the book. So if we want to leave it to that, we can leave it to that and advise students to watch it at their own leisure, but maybe won't be useful for their exam, you know, the rest of the seasons. There were times that I thought, oh, come on, how far will you take this? But they've signed for season 5, you know, and the ones of you who know what happens in season 4, you'll understand why they signed for season 5. And
yeah, I think it's always tricky for A-level teachers to get that balance of using these additional resources that are out there and making sure that students don't dwell too much on that in their exam pieces. But obviously we want students to engage with the culture that's around them as well. You know, life isn't just about exams. So I'm glad that you've brought up that topic. You mentioned there something which I'm interested in, which I didn't send you a question beforehand on this, but it's about the complicity of women in those power structures. So in the Handmaid's Tale, we have the aunt, we have Aunt Lydia, and then in the Testament, Aunt Lydia, of course, is a more fleshed out character, and we get to understand her motivation a little bit more. How does that link in with the idea of feminism if we have women who are complicit in oppressing other female characters?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. It's in all sorts of totalitarian regimes. And by the way, I think there is a book, I know there is a book I advise my students to always read, just to frame the whole thing. Because there was a question about 1984, and no, I don't think you need to read 1984 to understand the Handmaid's Tale, although you can if you want. And it's called In Other Worlds, Sci-Fi and the Human Imagination. And it's Margaret Atwood, it's essays, it's non-fictional. And she talks about dystopia there, and she talks about how dystopia works. And I always say to my students, use that in order to frame, you know, the novel, where she's coming from, what does she think? And she talks about utopias, that every society is not a utopia or a dystopia, it's somewhere in between. It's an utopia. And she always says that in totalitarian regimes, it's a good idea to use the oppressed people or members of the oppressed group to make sure that the others remain oppressed, you know, so use women to oppress other women. And of course, sisterhood is not very strong in the Handmaid's Tale, not to begin with, but then, well, it works very well because by giving the aunts a little bit of power, by giving the aunts the ability to read and write, and Penny's envy, of course, all these things have been mentioned wonderfully this earlier on. I think they managed to get the most loyal kind of protectors of the regime, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the aunts believe in all that. And like you said, Amy, if you read the Testaments, you understand where Aunt Lydia comes from. And by the way, Atwood said when they started the adaptation that no matter what you do not kill Aunt Lydia. Aunt Lydia remains alive, and Bruce Miller respected that, and she invited the actress who plays Aunt Lydia in various presentations of the Testaments of the country, which I thought was amazing. So yeah, it questions a lot of things about second wave feminism and sisterhood is strong and women supporting each other. And it goes back to Atwood always saying, because Atwood has a thing about being a feminist. I don't know if you've seen interviews, I've seen so many. I met her 3 times as well. And she always says, when they say, oh, you know, I think by now interviewers are quite savvy and they don't ask her directly, but in the other days, she used to say, well, what do you mean by feminism? You need to define it for me. Because she doesn't think that all women are wonderful and they're supporting other women and all men are horrible and that her expression should be shoved off a cliff and die. She thinks that we're all human beings, and they're good women and they're bad women, and they're good men and they're bad men, and we have to think about it like that. Also, she hugely questions, just go back to your question about women, doctrines of second wave feminism, and that, you know, in the Handmaid's Tale, actually some of the dogmas of second wave feminism are applied, you know, that they managed to make them the law, like women are not afraid to walk around, because no one's gonna, you know, no one's gonna dare try to rape them, and if they do, that they're gonna die. There's gonna be a salvaging, or even worse, a participation, execution and participate, and the handmaids will tear him to pieces, that like Menads in Greek mythology. So, but at the same time, they have no choice. So this is the price. The choice has been taken away. So
yeah, and I think some of that complexity that you're talking about there to do with the presentation of women is reflected in Offred's mother, who's obviously a very staunch feminist figure, very outspoken, but ends up being marginalized and kind of punished by the regime. It's quite a complex figure. What's your opinion on her?
I like her very much, to be honest. I think she's a lot of fun. But you know, I understand where she's coming from, and she is a representative of second wave feminism, and the burning of books is quite disturbing, isn't it? You know, the burning of pornographic books, because you think, well, in Hitler's Germany we had burning of books. When you burn books, you know, something is not right. It's off balance, you know, if you think about it in a democratic society. So I found that quite disturbing. But you know, she had guts. You know, she became a single mother. She put her money where her mouth was, in a way, and continued like that. And she did admit to Offred that none of the other feminists supported her. And again, that's an Atwood's little dig at, you know, it's not perfect. It accomplished so many things, and it's a wonderful thing that it exists, but it's not perfect. There's so many things we need to consider, not go to extremes. And she says, well, I wasn't supported because they thought I was too old to have a kid, and why did I want a kid, and I was a single mother. So you can see lack of sisterhood there as well.
Yeah, I'm just kind of glancing through my copy of the book, because I remembered a quotation when I read it through this week about how there's really positive kind of male relationships, fraternal relationships, the word fraternity, but we don't have the same equivalent. Oh, I've got it here. Fraternize means to behave like a brother. There's no corresponding word that meant to behave like a sister. Sorrowize it would have been, he said, from the Latin. So it's a really interesting kind of detail at the start of the book, isn't there? That fraternizing can happen, but in terms of sisterhood, we don't have that same level of relationship.
Yes. Well, it starts like that, but then it develops, because we see the seeds of rebellion, and we have, there is a bomb in Gilead, not there is a balm in Gilead. Sorry, sometimes I don't pronounce it correctly. In Gilead, and they start getting closer and start supporting each other. And the wonderful quote we had earlier on by Joanne again, when they're reaching across the beds and touching each other's hands and trying to lip read, and Moira at the beginning supporting June as we know her, but by deduction of the names at the beginning, we realize Offred is June, and they use that name in season 1. So and also it's really interesting, because in season 1, just to go back to the idea of sisterhood, she says they shouldn't have given us uniforms if they didn't want us to be an army. So going back to sororize, and is there such a thing? Well, it looks like it's developing. Also in season 1, this is stretching the book, obviously, following the development of the book. They refuse to kill Janine. They're ordered to, and they won't do it. They will do persecutions. They tear a man apart because they're ordered by the aunts, and this is what the regime is expecting of them. But they won't kill Janine. They refuse to. So I find all that very interesting.
Yeah, that's great. Shall we move on to some of the other questions? Because I think there's a couple here that haven't been touched on in the papers this morning. So one of them was about eco-criticism. So how might eco-criticism be applied to the Handmaid's Tale? So I was thinking about this when I was reading the novel this week, and about the control they exert over the environment, but how that results in the lack of crops, the lack of food, they've overfished, and so on. So it's not an interpretation I'd thought about before, but having reread it this week, I thought, well, of course, perfectly obvious, isn't it? So have you got any thoughts about eco-criticism in the book?
Yeah, I mean, she touches upon that. It's obvious there's been a nuclear disaster that's, you know, she doesn't explain. I mean, if you like to pick, you know, of course there are things not being fully explained, and that's where I think the TV adaptation comes in and fills in the gaps, which is fine. I think, yes, with the sort of some nuclear disaster and everything you mentioned, the crops not working, you know, overfished, you know, the environment, they don't have enough food. They keep on saying they're in war, because we have to remember that it's not the whole of the United States, that although again, geographically, we're not clear, it's definitely starts on the East Coast and spreads, but at some point they talk about being in war with Texas, and, you know, there are all sorts of other things going on, and having oranges from California, but then even California cannot be relied on and might not have oranges. So they make references like that all the time. Eco-criticism is not an area I work on, but there is a lot. There is eco-criticism, feminist eco-criticism, and of course a lot about the colonies and what's going on there. I think there's rich pickings there in relation to eco-criticism. And again, I don't mean to, I mean, there is quite a bit in the book, but not everything is expanded and explained. I suppose you could be writing forever. As it is, it's 360 pages, you know, and then we have the epilogue with the PX Soto and everything else that is going on. But I think in season 2, and I don't know if it's worth saying to the students, have a look, they do present the colonies and what's going on there. And you have nuclear waste colonies where they have life expectancy. It's mentioned in the book. That's where they send the really naughty people, either the handmaids who won't comply, or the handmaids who were removed to Jezebel's and it didn't work out for them, because you have life expectancy of 3 years. And then you have the other colonies where they try to cultivate the land more efficiently. So you have 2 kinds of colonies, which I hadn't always realized. I thought it's just one. So that's where eco-criticism is trying to raise awareness. And of course, she is extremely involved with the with herself, with the environment. She visits the Arctic Circle that she used to visit with her partner every year when her partner died. Graham Gibson, I think a year. With the pandemic, I lose time, to be honest, when things happen.
I think we've all done that.
I think it was it November September 2019. But I mean, I'm sure she still does it. So she's really involved with what's going on in the environment and how we can save the earth and things we should do. So yeah, I mean, if somebody wanted to write a paper on that, I think there'd be a lot to think think
Yeah, well, perhaps the person who posed the question
yes.
could do
there's a lot. Have a go, please.
Yeah.
And it's attracting attention by critics. So by academics, you know, they pick on that as well. Another thing that I wanted to mention that I find very useful for my students, and I put it on the reading list straight away because it sort of explains very clearly the historical background of the novel. I think somebody mentioned this morning that nothing in the novel hasn't already happened, and she says it again and again in interviews. And it's Shirley Newman's article about Shirley Newman is the critic. I was looking for it this morning, and of course I couldn't find it. And she talks about the historical background, what's going on, from visiting Afghanistan and in 1979 and seeing how people lived there and transferring some of that to Ceausescu's Romania and the women not allowed abortions, and they had to have 4 children because he wanted to have lots and lots of children that ended up in orphanages, and he was a horrible man, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot going on, and that's a good article for background reading.
I wonder, it's cheeky for me to ask, but would you be able to email me the reading list that you use for the course, and then I can share it with the participants this morning?
Of course I can. Yeah,
that would be really helpful. Thank you. Because I know as teachers who well, I certainly didn't study the Handmaid's Tale at university. I'm coming at it without all of the great kind of library resources that I had when I was a student. So it'd be really massively helpful. Elaine's just commented on the chat about Rachel Carson's The Silent Spring. Really helpful for the eco-critical perspective, of course. So something that we've touched on a couple of times this morning already is the final section of the Handmaid's Tale, where we have the professor commenting on it, and I think when I first read the novel, that really upset me, that section, because I was so invested in the truth of Offred's narrative. I realised that the speakers this morning have picked up on the evidence of the unreliability of that narrative. But then when you get to that final section and he questions, you know, is it real? Is it a reliable source of information? I find that as a reader quite upsetting, you know, because it kind of overturned my understanding of the first section of the novel. Why do you think we have these multiple narrative voices, these competing narrative voices in the text?
I think it goes back to what Joanne said about Sixou and Equator Feminine. I think she explained it all so well. I think because she's an unreliable narrator, and that's fair enough. And that's why we find her so relatable. I think if Moira had narrated the whole thing, perhaps because she's so, although obviously in the end she ends up in Jezebel's and then we don't hear about her. And of course, there's a different take in season 1, and they make her much more feisty. And I'll leave it to that because we're talking about the novel. I think she's flawed. She's a flawed character, and that's why we can relate. She's complex. She's flawed. She starts as politically indifferent. She keeps on talking about ignoring and ignorance, and we did it on purpose, and we had to work at it, and we didn't pay attention. And they pick up this line and they use it in the season as well. We didn't pay attention when Congress, you know, everybody was assassinated, and you know, we still didn't pay attention. So I think this is something that I say to the students, and I'm trying to be very careful. And I always say, just be politically aware. I realize you're very young and you don't want to watch the news every night. But all I can say is be aware and use your vote, because people were killed so you can vote. You know, they've sacrificed their lives. That's all I can say, because otherwise I can get into a lot of trouble. But I think that's why the voice is as it is. And I agree that it's never ending and it continues on. And she starts as really timid, and I want to survive, and I need to eat after the persecution, and I need to stay alive. And of course she does it for her daughter, but she's also incredibly timid and compliant. And as the novel progresses, I think she becomes bolder and bolder and bolder and more politically aware. We have to give her credit for that, no matter what Pixoto says. I don't care. I mean, he is the voice of patriarchy. He says, what wouldn't I give for a printout from the commander's computer? And you think, well, that's all you care about. She recorded the whole thing, you know. She could have been killed for it. And he questions everything. She questions herself. This is a personal narrative. And we all know with personal narratives, they're not reliable. You know, you need to read between the lines. And also people give different interpretations to what she says. But I think she has to be given credit for doing her best under seriously adverse circumstances.
And of course, Pixoto is satirized as well, isn't he? Which leads a whole other level of complication. I was just looking for the example where at the end of the novel, they announce the various activities that the participants are going to engage in the conference. And having attended quite a few academic conferences myself, you know, I can really understand the kind of social situation that she's mocking there. So Pixoto questions Offred's reliability, but then his own reliability himself is questioned as well. So it kind of really, you know, that phrase, are there any questions, it really leaves us with more questions than it does answers sometimes. So I think we're going to leave it there. I just want to say thank you so much, Karina, for talking to us this morning.
Thank you.
It's really enriched the morning. It's really helped us to gain an understanding of the text and kind of where the academic research is on this text as well. We're going to have a short break now for about 10 minutes. So Donald, if you're ready, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Amy. Thank you everyone as well for coming this morning. I know it's not easy to give up a Saturday for subject-specific CPD, but the talks so far and the chat with Karina has been brilliant. So hopefully I can add to that. As Amy says, what I'm going to be looking at are some of the historical precedents that underpin Atwood's speculative fiction. And I've deliberately used that word some because there's so many that I could talk about, but within the scope of 20 minutes, I've had to kind of narrow my focus quite a bit. But what I want to begin my presentation with really is actually how I teach the Handmaid's Tale to my students at A-level. And that's with an introduction to the words from the woman herself. And this is a quotation which has been touched upon in previous talks as well, about how Atwood doesn't, in the Handmaid's Tale, write about anything that's not already happened before. So this idea of historical precedent kind of underpinning her work is so, so important, I think. So she says, I made a rule for myself. I would not include anything that human beings had not already done in some other place or time. I did not wish to be accused of dark, twisted inventions or of misrepresenting the human potential for deplorable behavior. And I think that's such an important way into the text for students who may grapple with it upon first reading and think that it is rather kind of fantastical, and particularly when they're introduced to it as dystopian fiction. It's why I tend to kind of not avoid that word completely, but definitely refer to speculative fiction far more often, just to really reinforce that this isn't an imagined nightmare world. It's almost a world that is a precedent in many different areas of life that she's drawing from. So I think that's a really useful thing to kind of frame not just my presentation today, but also the novel as a whole. And it's a really good way, I think, to intrigue students as well into what is to come as they begin their reading and study of the text. So in terms of the actual historical precedents that I want to draw from them, that Atwood references in that quotation, the first part of my presentation is going to focus on the rise of the Christian right in America. Atwood in interviews talks about this idea quite a lot. And obviously, as Gilead is a totalitarian theocracy and religious extremism underpins a lot of what happens in Gilead, I think it's really important that we consider that kind of journey from, you know, the Old Testament to 17th century Puritanism, and then later to the kind of conservatism of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s when the novel was first published. I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about the American plan. The American plan, I think, is one of the most fascinating historical precedents that Atwood draws from in the novel. And the reason why I've chosen this one particularly over some other examples I could draw from is that I do feel like it's the lesser known historical precedent. Certainly a lot of my students, when I introduced this concept, had no idea or were quite shocked by this. So if you're not aware of the American plan, hopefully that will be quite enlightening. And then the third and final aspect I'm going to draw from is the idea of public executions. Obviously, as Karina talks about, the television show really kind of draws upon the idea of executions and the brutality of the regime in quite a lot more depth and detail than even the novel does. But how the novel engages with this idea of execution in a public setting, I think is so important. But again, it's not something that we've not seen before in history, as Atwood would rightly say. So I'm going to begin with the kind of rise of the Christian right in America. And as I say, it kind of is a long journey, this stemming from its origins within the kind of teachings of the Old Testament, right up to the 17th century kind of Puritanism in America that really becomes prevalent at that time, right up until the kind of context of reception when the novel's published in the 1980s with the presidency of Ronald Reagan. And I think looking at the scope of the rise of the Christian right in America really does inform the idea that Atwood says that she deliberately sets the novel in America because she feels that if any country was going to adopt a totalitarian theocracy, it would be America. And obviously, as a Canadian writer looking at America from the outside, perhaps it's quite a good satirical point she's making about the role of religion within American society. And the novel definitely unpicks that in lots of interesting and enlightening detail. So people have talked about earlier in their papers about the kind of connections to the Old Testament and particularly to Genesis as well. So I've deliberately tried to kind of avoid too much reference to that epigraph that Kerry, for example, talked about in her talk, just because I feel like that was covered already. So the one I want to really look at from the Old Testament is kind of how the Old Testament really infects or permeates the kind of language used in the society of Gilead. So the phrases found in the text that have been really kind of popularized in the television show, and as you can see on the screen as well through meme, blessed be the fruit and may the Lord open. Their kind of origin is really quite interesting when you look at how it draws from the book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament. And the phrases are found as part of the blessings of obedience, and their kind of function or purpose really is to encourage plenitude to faithful followers. And it draws from these quotes from the Bible: those who heed the voice of the Lord your God will receive blessings, the passage states. And it goes on to read, blessed be the fruit of your womb, followed later by the Lord will open for you. And you can see how Atwood has kind of used these phrases and paraphrased them slightly from Deuteronomy as well, just to kind of show the kind of influence of kind of Christianity and how that's used as a method of exploitation and a method of social control within Gilead. And the fact that the handmaids are kind of forced to use these kind of forms of address and greetings and language is a really good example, I think, about how Gilead is this theocracy that uses religion as its kind of primary method of control. But what Atwood goes on to say about the role of religion in interviews in the novel is that it's not just the fact that, you know, we're trying to recreate the Old Testament and going back thousands of years to set a precedent of what happens in Gilead. And she says in this quotation that America was not initially founded as an 18th century Enlightenment republic. So kind of critiquing this idea that, you know, America, the land of the free, and all these kind of concepts and connotations one might associate with that nation. She says it was initially a 17th century theocracy. And that tendency keeps bubbling up in America from time to time. So she talks about this idea of how the theocracy is something that has precedent in the historical makeup of America itself, and how every so often it keeps coming up. And Atwood, in not just The Handmaid's Tale, but other work that she's written, is really fascinated by kind of 17th century theocracy and kind of Puritan theocracy in America as well. And I do think there is kind of a link and allusion to this a lot within The Handmaid's Tale. And one particular allusion that she draws from, she mentions in interviews quite frequently, is about the story of Mary Webster, the half-hanged witch of Hadley. And she talks about how this figure within history has a massive impact in terms of her writing in The Handmaid's Tale. So Atwood cites kind of one woman's stories, the kind of particular major influence of the novel. And it is that kind of New England resident of the 17th century, Mary Webster, because Webster was at the center of one of the most infamous witchcraft cases preceding the Salem witch trials. And obviously the kind of Salem witch trials are such a key significant historical moment that's had such an impact in terms of the role of religion and control, and particularly as well, the kind of oppression of women, particularly. And essentially what happened to Mary Webster was that after a well-respected government and church leader in the small Puritan town of Hadley in Massachusetts fell ill, locals quickly drew the conclusion that a witch had to be involved, as is a very typical 17th century thing to do. I think we just call a doctor today. And they fingered the community Webster as the culprit and decided to physically assault her and hang her as punishment. But what's really interesting about her story, and the reason why her story lives on today, is that she survived. And her story is recounted in detail in the 1689 text, Memorable Providences, which set the stage really and kind of was the kind of forerunner of the Salem witch hysteria that kind of emanated as a result of cases like Mary Webster's. So I think that's a really kind of interesting idea to explore. particularly the idea of kind of hysteria based on kind of a woman having some kind of form of supernatural power and control over a male figure. I think that's really interesting from Atwood's point of view. This idea that, you know, women being blamed for the corruption of society is obviously something that's really unpicked within the world of Gilead. And Atwood, in that quote in the previous couple of slides, talked about how this kind of theocracy is bubbling up from time to time. And obviously, if we consider the context of the 1980s when the novel's published, she also points to the election of Ronald Reagan as president and the country's embrace of that kind of Christian conservatism as influences from the book. So Reagan's a really interesting character because I think students studying the text today will probably have very little recall of who Ronald Reagan is and what America was like under his presidency in the 1980s. But I think it is really important as teachers that we do try to give students a sense of the kind of context of reception. So how the novel was originally received in 1985. So in 1981, if you're unaware, Reagan becomes the first president to propose a constitutional amendment seeking to restore organized prayer in schools. And obviously this idea of kind of, you know, institutionalized prayer within structures in a public setting is something that is really mirrored within the world of Gilead's. Not only that, kind of throughout his candidacy and into his presidency, Reagan also closely aligned himself with two religious political organizations, the Moral Majority and Focus on the Family. And these were very much kind of modern conservative ideas that were coming to the fore. And that kind of temporary rise in power of groups such as them led to a kind of perceived idea that there may be a crackdown on women's access to abortion, for example, and certainly kind of more traditional kind of right-wing views on the role of women and reproduction really is kind of a hot button topic at this point in the 1980s. And obviously within Atwood's work, this is so important in terms of the handmaids being conceived as these, you know, two-legged wombs and how they are commodified in terms of their ability to reproduce in a world whereby we've got declining birth rates. So that's the first kind of historical precedent that I want to explore. The second one is regards the American plan. Now, the American plan is, I think, one of the most interesting kind of historical details to explore in relation to the Handmaid's Tale, as I mentioned earlier. And it was one, I must admit, that I didn't know tons about. I kind of heard it mentioned in passing, I suppose, when I was reading the novel, when I read the novel for the first time about 12 years ago. But what I essentially have done, as most of us will have done in our careers, I'm sure, is kind of just go down a bit of a rabbit hole of what this was. And I'm just going to signpost here some kind of further reading at this point in terms of, if you want to know more about the American plan beyond kind of what I talk about today, then this text here, and I make reference to it in the next slide in a quotation from Scott W. Stern, is really interesting. It's called The Trials of Nina McCall, and it looks at the American plan and gives a kind of really individual kind of perspective on what was happening at that time. So definitely kind of a wider reading, secondary reading text that might be of interest if anything strikes a chord with what I talk about next. So the American plan, if you don't know what it is, okay, essentially it is, I think, almost kind of a blueprint of how Gilead works in terms of its control of women and their sexuality and also their reproductive rights. So essentially, the United States government incarcerated tens of thousands, I'm going to repeat that, tens of thousands of, quote, promiscuous women in the 20th century. And this is really interesting. You know, Atwood wrote the novel in the kind of later part of the 20th century, but this is something that isn't that far away from when the novel's published in 85. And the program, known as the American Plan, started around World War I. And it was an attempt to protect American soldiers from sexually transmitted infections and prostitutions. And what's really interesting about that, in terms of kind of a feminist way of reading this program and also the novel as a whole, is the idea that once again, we see how kind of, you know, male American soldiers engage in sexual activity And obviously we know that 2 people need to be involved in sexual intercourse for an STI to actually take hold, yet it's all about how the women are being marginalized, oppressed and repressed in terms of sexuality. And it was these femme fatale figures seen as seductresses. And the plan is about trying to protect men from women such as these. There's no real focus on trying to stop men from engaging in sexual intercourse with the women themselves. So women suspected of carrying STIs, they were detained and locked up in reformatories, workhouses and jails, so prisons. And they were treated with, and this is kind of the most, I think, shocking aspect of the plan, with these toxic, ineffective, I must add as well, remedies such as arsenic and mercury, and they were sometimes sterilized. So this is a governmental-led program that has actioned and sanctioned the sterilization of women out of fear of their promiscuous nature. And obviously within the novel, you know, we have the commander, you know, we have Fred talk about, you know, the time past and how, you know, women were so free with their sexuality, and actually Gilead were doing them a service, and it was a way of making sure that they didn't succumb to their baser desires. And even that Lydia talks about that, you know, this idea of kind of, you know, freedom from as opposed to freedom to with regards to female sexuality. And what the historian Scott Stern, who wrote the text that I mentioned on the previous slide, what he says about the American plan, I think what summarizes it really, really well, is that it was one of the largest and longest lasting mass quarantines in US history. I think that's particularly apt to kind of explore today in terms of looking at quarantines in a COVID-19 pandemic context. But this idea of quarantine in terms of, you know, putting a stop on sexuality being explored as well. So I think that's really kind of interesting to explore as a concept and how it mirrors and parallels with the world of Gilead's. So the other thing about the American plan, though, as well, in terms of how it might link to some of the kind of social and political aspects of the novel too, is the kind of idea of resistance and rebellion that Karina talked about in her Q&A with Amy. So obviously in the Handmaid's Tale, we've got this depiction of a quiet underground rebellion amongst some of the women of Gilead known as the May Day resistance. And again, there's actually a parallel with May Day and what was happening as women began to revolt in the 20th century under the American plan as well. So Stern told Time magazine that in real female prisons under the American plan and women's prisons in general, there were huge numbers of riots. There were huge, truly mind-numbing numbers of women who escaped. So it wasn't the case, and I think Atwood draws upon this really well, that we had this kind of government-led kind of oppression of women, and there was no resistance or rebellion to that. There was, and that's the kind of key message from Atwood, isn't it? There's always going to be resistance to kind of totalitarianism. So it offers some kind of optimism and hope in a way that, you know, people will kind of challenge the kind of status quo that's imposed upon them, even if it's a horrific one and a dangerous one as well, as it was in the American plan, and obviously in a more extreme sense under the regime of Gilead too. My third and final historical precedent that I want to draw from is the idea of public executions. So obviously public executions take place in many forms throughout the novel. And Karina talked about this in a Q&A, and I want to kind of pick this up as well, this kind of idea of persecutions. And this is my favorite word from the novel, persecutions. I spent quite a long time in lessons talking about this with the students. So persecutions are a specific type of execution or salvaging within the Republic of Gilead. And I love how Atwood kind of uses language here to portray it. So the use of the portmanteau of persecution, combining or blending the words of participation and execution. And I think that's so clever from Atwood, because I think what she's trying to draw from and what she tries to do with persecutions amongst the handmaids is that it sort of enforces complicity in the crimes of Gilead and the violent world in which they've created. So the fact that handmaids are kind of forced to kill others and be involved with executions themselves, I think is such a clever, and I say this in a morbid sense, method of societal control. because they internalize the teachings of Gilead through active participation. And actually, this was, if you weren't aware, modeled after the name as well of a Canadian exercise program founded in the 1970s called Participaction. And Participaction was obviously about trying to, do a social good in terms of encouraging more people within Canada to take up exercise. But I love how Atwood kind of takes something that was quite wholesome and uses this and twists this in such a dark way to create persecutions within the world of Gilead as well. And I think it's a real kind of good example of dark humor that she's famous for in her works. And I think that's something that's sometimes missed as well, a little bit with The Handmaid's Tale. So it's obviously incredibly bleak, but you do have these light moments of kind of clever wordplay, which I think is really good to draw from as well. We've talked a lot about kind of historical events as well, but obviously Atwood as a writer is also influenced by other great writers. And in interviews, she also talks about the kind of influence of Émile Zola and how that really inspired her when it came to writing The Handmaid's Tale as well. So and this is a quote again from Atwood herself that I'll just read to you, but she makes reference to one of Émile Zola's novels, Germinal. And she says this about it. In Zola's novel Germinal, which is based on real life, so again, there's the historical precedent, 19th century coal mining enterprises, the guy who runs the company store is exacting sex from the wives and daughters of the coal miners in order to sell them goods because they didn't have any money. So when the women get the chance, they tear him apart and put not his head, but his genitalia on a pike and parade it around. So there you see actually that kind of persecution in action in a novel that precedes The Handmaid's Tale as well. And Atwood is very upfront about this when she speaks about this in interviews, that if she's going to make the point that everything that happens in The Handmaid's Tale is something that happens in history, she also goes to extend that from, she's going to draw from literary texts as well. But what's important here, I suppose, is that Zola's novel is drawing from a real life context too. And again, like Atwood, is using historical precedent to present an idea. And it's an absolutely gruesome moment of the novel in Germinal. But I think you can see the parallels and allusion really to what happens in Gilead and in Atwood's creation. And Amy talked about earlier that, lots of you today might be studying The Handmaid's Tale for AQA Lit B spec. And if you do, there's a good chance that you might be studying this alongside The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini. And I think one thing we can also talk about in terms of public executions, what's been drawn from in terms of the complicity as well of, active participants being involved in executions, is the kind of enactment of Sharia law under Taliban rule. And obviously, in The Kite Runner, for instance, Hosseini draws upon the rise of the Taliban in '96 and how they enact public executions through stoning. And there's a really famous scene at Ghazi Stadium in the novel towards the end, whereby a man and woman are stoned to death for the crime of adultery. So again, there is precedent in this text whereby these things do occur in society, and Atwood is really open and honest and drawing from them. So for example, when you kind of explore kind of what kind of extremist ideology of Islam might apply to Sharia law, they draw from this quote that the fornicators among the married men and married women stone them as exemplary punishment from Allah, and Allah is mighty and wise. So this idea that, we see other societies, we see other worlds drawing upon this idea of complicity in public executions. And this is something that, for students who might not be familiar with the work of Zola, for example, and his novel Germinal, then there is kind of a connection to what's happening in a contemporary sense with regards to the Taliban rule in Afghanistan today as well. So I think that's a really good idea to kind of draw from potentially too. And finally, just to kind of wrap up what I've kind of been talking about, I suppose the way I kind of want to look at historical precedent is through the distinction with dystopian fiction. If we accept that dystopian fiction is a contemporary literary subgenre that falls under the umbrella genre of speculative fiction, then It's really this type of fiction that predicts the possible. And I think that's what's really important here. It's not about kind of creating some insane, unimaginable world of sheer cruelty. It's actually about these things can happen and may happen in the future. So be wary of that. So it kind of predicts the possible, oppressive, futuristic, socio-political changes that deprive the society of worldly pleasures. So Atwood very much is in the camp of all of what happens in The Handmaid's Tale is possible. So I think that's what acts as a really stark warning to the readers. But I also think it's why it's such an important text, even 20 years or so after its publication. That's everything for me. Thank you so much for listening. Do feel free to tweet me if you want to follow up anything.
Overlapping things as well, so hopefully I'll be able to add to that conversation a little bit. And Donald as well, thank you so much for all those contextual things. There were so many things that you talked about that I hadn't even heard about before, so that's given me a lot to look into and to research further. So I'm going to be picking up today on questions of authenticity, narration and readership in Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. And just to give you a bit of an outline, I'm going to divide the talk into two sections. And in the first section, I'm going to be examining Offred as a postmodern narrator and looking at her unreliable narration, and arguing that ultimately her emphasis on her own unreliability paradoxically serves to underline the truth of her narrative. And I know that that idea of truth and plural truths is something that has been picked up on in previous talks today, and that's something I'm going to talk about as well. And in the second half, I'm going to look at Professor Piaxoto's reductive reading of Offred's narrative in the historical notes, and draw upon the historical notes to posit that male scholars who invite us to question Offred's authenticity as a narrator serve instead to highlight the reductive nature of their own reading. So to start off then, Offred really foregrounds her own unreliability within The Handmaid's Tale, which, like I've said, paradoxically points to the authenticity of her narrative. So this is taken from chapter 23, where she says, "This is a reconstruction. All of it is a reconstruction. And it's a reconstruction now in my head as I lie flat upon my single bed. When I get out of here, if I'm ever able to set this down in any form, it will be a reconstruction then too, at yet another remove. It is impossible to say a thing exactly the way it was." So if it's impossible to say a thing exactly the way it was, Offred doesn't try. She tells things more than once. She revises them within the text. And this links to Elaine's talk from this morning about how Equator Feminine from this series about gaps, fluidity, shifting and plurality. And Offred does point out the gaps, but she points them out so that we know they are there. Rather trying to cram her traumatic experiences into a neat and linear narrative, thinking about those visuals that Elaine showed us, which would be less authentic. She tells things more than once to mirror the fragmentation and the plurality of her experience within Gilead. So this is very clear when she talks about her experiences with Nick and the night that she has sex with Nick. And she tells this more than once to reflect the real feeling of the moment. So she tells it once, she tells it again, and then she says, "It didn't happen that way either. I'm not sure how it happened, not exactly. All I can hope for is a reconstruction. The way love feels is always only approximate." So if the way love feels it's always only approximate and there's no language that could actually capture it, the fact that she tells it once and tells it again doesn't make her unreliable. It makes manifest the blur of events as they have happened for her and the playing and repeating of events afterwards, that as she's gone over them in her mind and tried to figure out exactly what has happened. So in that light, then, Offred is more reliable as a narrator because she is acknowledging that she doesn't know the truth of the event herself, and therefore she stops short of making one up as a less reliable narrator might and opens up the possible pluralities of real experience to us. So this is something that Dominic Grace takes further in a brilliant article. I really enjoyed it and I'd recommend checking it out, called The Handmaid's Tale, Historical Notes and Documentary Subversion. And he argues that by fictionalizing, by thinking of her experience as those in the story, by inventing multiple possibilities, Offred can come to terms to some extent with what is happening to her. The truth resides more in the story Offred constructs or reconstructs than it does in the facts. Gleaning truth from this text requires accepting its fictionality as a medium for that truth. So the key idea that I want to pick out from there is that idea of Offred can come to terms with what has happened to her. Perhaps she's telling things in more than one way as a kind of therapeutic function to the narrative to process her trauma. And in that light, the fictionality of her narrative becomes a medium for truth, because these retellings and gaps reflect her mental state as a prisoner within Gilead. So Offred has become fragmented due to her experience in Gilead, and she points to this within the language that she uses when she says, "I'm sorry, the story is in fragments, like a body caught in crossfire or pulled apart by force." And that image of a body, I think, is important, that she compares her story to her body, because it foregrounds that parallel between her body and what is happening to her physically and mentally in Gilead, and the form that her story takes. So she potentially is that body, and the fragmentation of the fact that she's been pulled apart by forces within Gilead is reflected in her narrative style. So just to sum up that idea then, by drawing attention to her unreliability, Offred paradoxically makes herself more reliable as a narrator, because her experiences within the narrative are more authentic for her pointing to the gaps and the inconsistencies. And this is really important for Offred, because for her, her narrative is a form of escape. It's an escape route from Gilead. And the telling of her tale is a construction of a self that may make it out to Gilead where her physical self doesn't. So she says, "I intend to get out of here. It can't last forever. Others have thought such things in bad times before this, and they were always right. They did get out in one way or another, and it didn't last forever, although for them it may have lasted all the forever they have." So in that way then, one way or another, she's pointing to the fact that even if it is just in her story, she might make it out of Gilead. So therefore, for Offred, her fiction does become a medium for truth, because it has to be the most authentic and therefore the most fragmented version of herself that escapes. Because her experiences are multiple and complex, that is the form that her narrative has to take. And if she pinned her narrative down to a linear, restricted tale, she wouldn't be doing herself justice, and it wouldn't be her most authentic self that makes it out of Gilead. So there's an irony, obviously, here, and this is something that people have picked up on already today, in that the intradiegetic readers, so the readers from within the world of the text and the historical notes, don't receive her tale how she intended it. They seem disappointed, particularly Professor Piexoto, as he's the one delivering the talk, disappointed at the unreliability that they perceive, preferring cold facts to the kind of multiplicity of Offred's tale. So this is going to bring me into the next part, when I'm going to start examining Professor Piexoto's historical notes. And he invites us, as has already been pointed out today, to question Offred's authenticity. He calls his talk "Problems of Authentication," but it's his judgment that we are ultimately led to question. And this links really well to Kerry Boyle's talk from earlier this morning, and the idea of historical metafiction, which is a concept that I hadn't heard of before, so that's really useful and gives me something to go away and look at. But the quote that Kerry Boyle put up was, "The postmodern novels openly assert that there are only truths in the plural and never one truth." So we are led to embrace these plural truths and led to question that the Professor Piexoto, who is looking for just one truth. And crucially, it is him that we are led to question, and his reading of the tale, rather than Offred's unreliability, which is, as has been pointed out today, by a fact. So it's interesting that throughout the historical notes, Professor Piexoto refers to Offred as an author, and I've been referring to her as a narrator so far in this talk. But he's foregrounding, by pointing her out as an author, he's foregrounding her agency in reconstructing her narrative and pointing to the fact that she potentially has an agenda in telling her story. But there's an irony to this, because it's his role and Professor Wade's role in chopping up and reconstructing the narrative in the way that they see fit. The quote that he says is, "It was up to Professor Wade and myself to arrange the blocks of speech in the order in which they appeared to go." So it's their guesswork and their ordering of the narrative in the way that they think it should be told, which ultimately makes the one unequivocal truth that they are looking for impossible to find. And he doesn't acknowledge that anywhere in the historical notes, that his level of editing is what makes the truth impossible to find. And by attributing the title of the whole novel, The Handmaid's Tale, to these professors, that kind of has a further level of depersonalization as well. So Atwood was originally going to call the novel Offred, which would have foregrounded Offred's role and use to the state in her role as a handmaid and her belonging to the commander. But by attributing it to the scholars, she kind of gives it a further level of depersonalization to Offred's narrative, because the Handmaid's Tale just becomes part of a wider body of scholarship. It's simply the Handmaid's Tale within Gileadian studies, as opposed to our experience as the extra diegetic reader from outside of the world of the text, of the Handmaid's Tale being our whole experience of Gilead, obviously until the Testaments came along and the series. And the fact that this is a nod to Chaucer as well, the superscription, this is a quote from the text, the superscription The Handmaid's Tale was appended to it by Professor Wade, partly in homage to the great Geoffrey Chaucer, could also point to the fact that Offred's voice in the historical notes is being overridden and oppressed by male scholars. And this is something that Amy mentioned before, how upsetting that is to read. And I had a similar experience when I read the historical notes, felt quite angry at the fact that Offred's tale is being ridden over roughshod by these professors. But that ultimately serves to foreground the fact that Professor Piaxoto has a very Gileadian mindset when he is looking at Offred's tale. And he becomes very comparable to the commander from earlier in the text. So like the commander, he has this very reductive, male-centric, fact privileging mindset when he's looking at Offred's narrative. And he says, so the commander says, when Offred and him are talking about the concept of love, but look at the stats, my dear, was it really worth it falling in love? So he reduces that whole idea of love, that very multiple plural human experience, to a statistical failure. And the professor also privileges facts and statistics over things that have real human meaning, like Offred's trauma as well. So he says, if we could identify the elusive commander, we felt at least some progress would have been made. So he sees Offred's narrative as just a key to get at the commander, and completely disregards any actual significance or importance that could be taken from her text, from her tale. And this is again ironic, because Offred has preempted to an extent the fact that she will be forgotten in this way. She says earlier in the text, from the point of view of future history, this kind will be invisible. And here she's talking about Gileadian history. She's imagining the wives looking back with the daughters at history and forgetting the role that the handmaids played in bringing about and establishing that society. So this again flags up some similarities between Gilead and post-Gilead, and that seeming dichotomy between the two breaks down and becomes a lot more fluid when we think about this, because the professor is reading the Handmaid's Tale in a very similar way that Offred preempts of Gileadian readers of history. So Offred is reduced to a problem of authenticity. And the professor expresses a lot of regret at the gaps that he perceives in her narrative. So he says, many gaps remain. Some of them could have been filled by our anonymous author had she a different turn of mind, had she the instincts of a reporter or spy. So this idea about gaps is interesting, again, thinking about Equator Feminine in light of Elaine's talk from this morning. The gaps are the points for Offred. She's pointing out the fragmentation of her experience. whereas these male readers expect a neat linear tale that answers all questions. And he says, the professor says, what would we not give now for even 20 pages or so of printout from Waterford's private computer? So that vague throwaway comment of 20 pages or so, it could be the commander's shopping lists that he would privilege over the Handmaid's Tale, and that is very jarring for us as a reader who has lived with Offred and experienced her traumas within Gilead. So when the professor ends the novel with, "Are there any questions?" And I agree with Kerry, this is a very powerful end to the novel that really stuck with me as well when I read it. It serves to foreground the fact that the extra diegetic reader, so us outside of the world of the text, has a very different set of questions to the intradiegetic readers of the historical notes. So we want to know about Offred, what happened to her, did she survive, what were the circumstances of her telling the tale, and so forth. Whereas the intradiegetic readers seem to only want to know what about the commander, what about the facts, what about how Gilead worked, what were the mechanics. And this is something that Andrew Atherton sums up really well in a talk that's available on Lit Drive, and I would recommend you to check it out if you might have seen it already. I think it's called the Role of the Historical Notes in the Handmaid's Tale. And he says, this is just a paraphrase from his talk, he says, are there any questions, when we are asked, are there any questions, we are invited and encouraged to challenge the way in which Gileadian studies has framed and treated Offred's story. This encapsulates and enacts the entire thrust of the novel and its challenges to power. So the notes enact the thematic concerns of the novel as a whole by putting us in an emotional position where there is no other option but to challenge authority. But crucially, it's not Offred's narratorial authority that we are invited to question, it's rather the male-centric and fact-privileging reading, which aligns post-Gilead with Gileadian ideals. But we can start to think of the Handmaid's Tale as a text as a whole, as a bit of a trap, and it's a trap that some critics have fallen into when reading it in a Gileadian way themselves and not kind of picking up on this questioning of authenticity that Atwood invites us to do of the historical notes in the professor's reading of Offred's tale. So two such critics are Prosler and Georgiou, who argue that the historical notes emphasise the fictionality of Offred's narrative and undermine the already shaken credibility of the narrator. Now, obviously, I disagree, because I would argue that Offred is more reliable due to her unreliability. And these critics seem to be accepting the professor as a comparative authority to Offred in terms of narrative, even while recognising that the historical notes is, in their words, a fictional text in itself. So even within that fictional world, they still believe the professor over Offred, which serves to highlight some parallels between post-Gilead and us. And this links quite well to Donald's talk from just before. Because of the parallels between Gilead and post-Gilead that I've pointed out already, there becomes this kind of unnerving continuation between the societies, between Gilead, post-Gilead, and then our society as well. And this has wider implications for us as readers of The Handmaid's Tale, and more broadly as readers of fiction and history. So just linking back to Donald's talk, Atwood says that the novel was written not as science fiction, but as a slight twist on the society we have now. So these are very intentional, it's a very intentional fluidity between the divisions we might initially perceive between our society and the societies of the text. And Grace picks up on this as well in the same article that I've previously referenced, where he says this story is not really fiction at all, for all of the Gileadian atrocities have occurred in reality already. They will continue to do so as long as we contextualise, compartmentalise and historicise them in order to avoid judging them. So here Grace points to a real danger of falling into a reductive reading like Prosler and Georgiou and like Professor Piexoto, because if we read in this kind of reductive way, post-Gilead becomes very much closer to our own society. If we continue to compartmentalise and historicise the atrocities that we see, they will only be perpetuated within our society. So in that light, post-Gilead becomes not evidence of how Gilead fell, but how that ideology can be and is perpetuated after and in our society. And Atwood has said that the critical reception of the novel in America can be summed up as how long have we got and how can we prevent it? And I would argue that the answer to how can we prevent it is within Grace's reading. I mean, obviously, how can we prevent it? Well, we can't, because it's all taken from things that have already happened. But if we look at Grace's reading, where he says, as long as we contextualise, compartmentalise and historicise them, we have the opportunity to move away from these atrocities if we shift our priorities as a reader, and if we start to embrace fiction, plurality, multiplicity, as opposed to reductive readings that reduce atrocity and that make them kind of a safe separate. So just to conclude then, Offred's self-conscious unreliability as a postmodern narrator paradoxically underlines her reliability through her rendering of her own fragmentation, in contrast to Piexoto's attempts to draw attention to Offred's unreliability, which point to the limits of his own reading. And Professor Piexoto's fact privileging foregrounds the continuation of Gileadian thought in post-Gilead society, which serves to draw uncomfortable parallels between our society and that of the historical notes, and leads us to reassess our priorities as a reader of The Handmaid's Tale, but also of fiction and of history more broadly. So thank you so much for listening. That's everything from me today. My Twitter handle and email address are on the slide. If anyone has any questions that they want to, or something that they want to discuss further, you're really welcome to contact me. Thank you very much.
So Joanna's going to speak about the female body in The Handmaid's Tale. So I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you. Just let me know if for some reason you can't see it. I mean, the technology aspect of this is hard for I think everyone to kind of work out. So welcome to this session on the female body in The Handmaid's Tale. And I'm really glad actually that I've heard all of the amazing presentations today, because as Amy said, I want to kind of build on certain bits, and there's definitely some things that Donald said that I'm going to try and kind of develop and expand upon. So first of all then, we're going to think about the female body as a kind of locus or a site of surveillance and fear. And the way I want to do this is to think about criticism in the way that lots of the other talks are focused on. But we all know that although whilst this is kind of a primarily subject knowledge conference, actually we're always thinking about how we would then prepare and present these ideas to our students. So I want to think about how we might read certain critical lenses and how we might apply those critical lenses to particular moments in the text to kind of illustrate certain meanings and interpretations for our students. So we're going to begin with looking at Gilead's explicit and the more subtle demonstrations of power, and building on what Donald was speaking about, kind of dystopian speculative fiction, and how we might use genre as a way to explore the difference and the different ways in which power is displayed and exhibited. I'm then going to move on to talking about the objectification and reification of the female body. And I think it's how the female body is used as a tool of oppression. I think the way we see Gilead as a very newly formed political structure, the way it therefore kind of enacts power is an attempt to solidify that fragility that Gilead has, that and in its attempts to seem more powerful, actually we see the cracks and the fragility behind it. We'll then turn to, and we'll look at kind of feminist theory there through the objectification. And then finally, I want to focus on Foucauldian theory, so picking up on the work of Michel Foucault, and in particular looking at surveillance and this concept of panopticism, which actually was, I mean, I looked at the chat as I was watching Donald's presentation, and I'm glad that I wasn't the only one that hadn't heard of the American plan. But I think the book that he referenced when he talked about surveillance, particularly on kind of the sexualized female body, that will read really well into looking at Foucauldian theory. And actually, there was a moment at the beginning of the session where I was kind of checking that my camera wasn't on and that my mic wasn't on because I was eating my breakfast, and I was like, well, no one needs to see that. But actually, the fear that the camera was on and I had to kept genuinely every couple of mouthfuls checking to see whether someone was watching me, and it's that fear, that internalized state of surveillance, which kind of underpins all of Gileadian power structures. So first then, I think with anything as abstract as power, when we're looking at kind of thematic exploration with students, it can be really helpful to get them to define what it means to them, but also to see what actual kind of definitions and kind of conflicting definitions already exist within the term itself. So the OUP defines power with specific kind of synonyms, but actually, as we know, all language exists on a kind of spectrum of meaning. So they have slightly different connotations and different inferences. So power can be seen as controlling people, control of a country or through a country, ability, authority, influence. And actually, we know that power in general and through the Handmaid's Tale and in Gilead, it can be physical, it can be violent, it can be forceful, or actually perhaps the most terrifying shows of power within the society. It can be Hidean, Machiavellian, cunning, scheming, and deceitful. And I think what's important to kind of focus on is that much of the terror and fear within Gilead and the way that power is enacted upon its people, upon Gilead's people, comes from the political machine's ability to demonstrate their power at every level of meaning. So in terms of ability, authority, influence, explicit displays of power, implicit displays of power, and on a more kind of symbolic level. So some of the overt visual displays of power are really interesting. And the first one then that I want to pick up on is this idea that in the very opening of The Handmaid's Tale, when we've got the kind of analeptic narrative filtering through from Offred, she talks about how pre-Gilead, the police or the army or whoever they were would open fire almost as soon as any of the marches even started. So notice then that the architects of Gilead's power are so often ambiguous. There's this kind of vague language always associated with them. So even in these overt and visual displays of Gileadian power, the agents are always anonymous. The source of the suffering, so the who behind this, Offred thinks it might have been the police or the army, but what's important is that she does not know. And it was the police and the army and her kind of remembrance and her memory of it, they are invoked as kind of faceless symbols. They're historically patriarchal, which I think is important to pick up on, that as institutions they have historically been used as tools to enact patriarchal power. If we're thinking of, as Donald said, that this is a world in which it's the potential possibility and what has already happened and kind of the melding of all these ways in which people have been oppressed into this kind of form of speculative fiction. Actually, I think it's important that she uses the police and the army as these historically patriarchal figures. But she isn't sure, she doesn't know who it was that started to combat this opening rebellion. It's that uncertainty and that fear which allows the regime to take control in the first place. So by approaching that kind of quotation and that idea of ambiguous threat and ambiguous power through dystopian conventions, as we probably would with our students before thinking about, actually, is it dystopian, is it speculative fiction? One of the conventions we might generally look at with them is that there is a philosophical or religious control often in dystopian texts. So society is controlled by philosophical or religious ideology, often enforced through a dictatorship or theocratic government, as many people have kind of touched on before. And it's in Gilead, it is enforced by a constant and anonymous barbaric threat. And then we've got also this kind of linguistic motif or refrain that kind of permeates the text, under his eye. And we know that language is controlled within Gilead, and it's a kind of seemingly obvious kind of simplicity with under his eye. But as that recurring linguistic motif, it works on multiple levels. So we take that with students, we think about the multiple kind of interpretations that gives. All members of Gilead, but particularly handmaids, are kind of systematically reminded of their subservience through that motif that they're encouraged to speak. So they are under, if we think about that preposition, they're under the authority and surveillance, which we will come to later, of a anonymous, again, him. So is that a commander? Is that a guardian? Is that an angel or an eye, or even God himself? So the patriarchal authority is layered, and it is anonymous, and it is uncertain and unsure, and it is that which keeps the oppressed. So in this kind of theocratic government, as Karina touched on earlier, the agents of control are always normally male, except of course for the deputisation of the arts, which is a whole other really interesting display of power to give certain amounts of power. We only have to look at kind of the use of guards in concentration camps. By giving a certain group of people who are already oppressed a little bit of power, you create that structure of control that is so much easier to enforce. And it's kind of a concession to maintain the illusion of some female power. And of course, with that under his eye, it's that linguistic refrain that kind of keeps going throughout the text that just displays and subtly reinforces that kind of authority and that patriarchal anonymous power. And then finally, we might look at the ceremony as, of course, an overt display of Gilead's power. But obviously, there is so much language in the ceremony that is so rich to explore with students, but there is one kind of seemingly innocuous word in that quotation which I want to draw attention to. Above me, towards the head of the bed, Serena Joy is arranged, outspread. And I think it's really interesting that Gilead chooses, and the agents of Gilead choose to display and ceremonialize rape. And it becomes, as it was hinted at, as it was said before, kind of state-sanctioned rape is sanctioned through biblical precedent. But it isn't just kind of an enactment of look what we can do to you, look what we can turn you into. It is displayed, and the people involved are forced to participate in a kind of tableau of female suffering and a tableau of staged ceremonial sacrifice. Even Serena Joy is arranged, outspread. There is a laying on of female suffering, or a laying out, I should say. So let's now look at more subtle displays of power. So they're kind of the three, there are so many more examples of overt displays of power, but as I've said, kind of Gilead works in its ability to do both and to do all at the same time. So this beautiful quotation was touched upon earlier. In the semi-darkness, we could stretch out our arms when the aunts weren't looking and touch each other's hands across space. Some of the most haunting moments in the narrative, I think, come from the narrative silence that Offred displays. She remembers this happening when she was in kind of the Red Centre, the training centre of Handmaids. And I think it's important that, as was touched on by Karina and Amy in the session, that ability to communicate for women is limited and reduced because of the fear that the female body and the female subjectivity holds for Gileadian power. So in this centre, the women are infantilized in army cots, but there is a yearning implied in that quotation where there is a desperation, a desire to feel connected to other women, to feel physical connection, but more importantly, a connection on the basis of subjectivity, a connection from mind to mind. And in order to try and control that subjectivity, which of course, in all of Offred's interior analectic narrative, that's the real locus of fear for Gilead. It's in your ability to think for yourself, as we so often see in dystopian and speculative fiction. So in order to prepare them for their life as reductive handmaids, they'll, the life that they'll lead is kind of breeding stock. The female body is deliberately disconnected from others. And indeed, kind of Offred remembers that the discussion she has with Luke at the beginning through that analectic narrative, that beautiful quotation that was touched on earlier, he said that there was no corresponding word that meant to behave like a sister. So whilst the language exists to discuss and legitimise male communication, there is no such word as sororize, we learn. And it's that kind of erasure of female experience that permeates the text, which I think is a nice way of looking at Kerry's talk on the palimpsest, but also the American plan that many of us hadn't really heard about. It's that deliberate silencing of female experience and female oppression. So again, by kind of placing this anxiety regarding female communication within the context of a genre, we can see that the seeds of Gilead are already there within patriarchal society. As Donald said, this isn't a world, this isn't a terrifying imagined world. It's a futuristic, oppressive societal control, but it is through that exaggerated worst case scenario is one way that we can read it. And dystopian literature often makes a criticism about current trends, societal norm or political system. But whilst it can be tempting to view dystopian literature through that exaggerated worst case scenario, Ketterer writes in Atwood's Contextual Dystopia that reading that the future Atwood describes was surely not conceived as a direct extrapolation from our present. Although it's referencing present anxieties, it's not a direct extrapolation, but more as a pendulum swing away from present day feminism. Donald took us through some really interesting current contemporary anxieties for Atwood, particularly regarding women's rights and Reagan era politics. And I think viewing The Handmaid's Tale as an example of how the political spectrum can so often swing is really significant, and it called to mind for me the way that kind of political systems can have this pendulum swing from one end of the spectrum to the other. So for example, the liberalism of Carter to Nixon, and even more kind of present for our students from Obama to Trump, and there's this idea that pendulum swing away, it's a reaction against the very present fears surrounding female power and the rights that women have over their own bodies. And it's almost as though actually this text is, the term zeitgeist can be used here, that Atwood captures this mood, this zeitgeist or tipping point for women's rights at this moment, and then the very real patriarchal fear that hovers over this progress of women's rights. So then we might look on to kind of summarize the way in which the female body exists as this site or locus of anxiety. And we might look at Martha Nussbaum's definition of objectification or reification. So she gives us 7 initial stages of objectification here: instrumentality, denial of autonomy, inertness, fungibility, violability, ownership, and denial of subjectivity. And this could be a really useful process to take students through to see the ways in which Gilead uses these processes to dehumanize women and to construct the female body as this site of fear. And in doing so, of course, in constructing anything as a site of anxiety or fear or surveillance, it gives it power. It gives it even more power than it already had. So we might look then at the disparate process by which someone is turned from a sentient, autonomous human being into a thing. And we can see how Gilead objectifies at every turn, particularly in women. And you can look at this and consider how it also does this through men, but in looking at the female body as a site of fear, I think it can really explore the ways in which patriarchal power fears the female body. So this idea of we are 2-legged wombs, that's all, sacred vessels, ambulatory chalices. Rather than a generic instrumentality that Nussbaum talks about, handmaids really are treated as instruments, as 2-legged wombs. And we can see the way in which they are dismembered into functional limbs, defined by that generative function. They're also a homogenous collective, we. So that denial of autonomy, that denial of individuality is systemic, and it's important to maintain control. Individuality, as we know, is kind of forbidden in Gilead. The ceremony, of course, is a kind of perfect example of an exercise in Gileadian power. Look what we can do to you, for example. But Offred's narrative disassociation and detachment, I think, is really significant. One detaches oneself, one describes. And then later on, of course, she says, nor does rape cover it. Nothing is going on here that I haven't signed up for. And so what's interesting is that removal of the first person perspective that Offred, of course, as a transcript, as an example of memory trauma, as an example of survivor genre, that first person perspective is so important for the text. In the ceremony, that is shifted into a third person, detached formality of one detached oneself, one describes. And of course, we can read that and we should kind of welcome loads of interpretations here, that it's not only a coping mechanism for Offred and her psychological survival to detach oneself. We can see that in lots of kind of abuse trauma stories, but as a symbol of Nussbaum's second process of objectification, that denial of autonomy. Offred has necessarily internalized the denial of autonomy, ironically asserting that rape doesn't cover it. She's signed up for this life, despite, of course, we know in this through a feminist lens that there is no real choice that she has, but she has to assert that in order to arguably kind of protect her subjectivity, protect her space of being June in this world that calls her Offred. And the ceremony, of course, renders her passive. Lying still, therefore I lie still and picture the unseen canopy over my head. I remember Queen Victoria's advice to her daughter, close your eyes and think of England. And we get those darkly humorous moments, as Donna was speaking about here. The lying still, she's forced to assume an image of docile, submissive femininity that we see so often in patriarchal readings of texts. And as I was planning this, I realised I didn't have enough time to talk about everything I wanted to. It's this idea that the ceremony renders female sexuality in a hyperbolized, yes, but the seeds of it are still there in Sleeping Beauty, in the way in which female sexuality is designed to be receiving, it's designed to be passive in a patriarchal, hyper-patriarchal reading of the text. And I could go on, but all of Nussbaum's definitions, and it's important to add here that Langton in 2009 added 3 more: reduction to body, reduction to appearance, and silencing. Those as a lens through which to read the female body in the text can be really, really powerful. And actually, it could be a lovely task to do with students in a revision of the text to look at the way in which each of those processes are used by Gilead to enact power. Okay, then I'm going to move on now to Foucauldian theory. So, and panopticism as a concept. So I could waffle on for a very long time about Michel Foucault if I had my chance, but as I'm talking through this, if it's something that you have kind of knowledge of, feel free, as Dumbledore would say, to kind of allow your attention to wander freely. But I'm going to kind of try and quickly summarize what Foucault was doing in the 70s. So as a literary critic and philosopher, Foucault worked on the concept of surveillance, and really, rather than external surveillance, how external surveillance creates an internalized state of surveillance within those being watched. And he looked at the birth of modern prisons, and actually, I was going to do a whole section, and I'm glad I didn't, because Donald's reference means I can just kind of build on it here, on the way in which, essentially through this work, it's called Michel Foucault, Discipline and Punish, and it's the way that the birth of modern prisons has developed. And he talks about bodies. He talks about how historically the body has been the site of punishments, hanging, drawing, quartering, and how that enactment of discipline on the body became more humane through the guillotine, through hanging, for example. And then eventually, as public opinion changed, it became more focused on the prisoner's subjectivity and the prisoner's internal sense of identity, and how to focus on that rather than the body as an overt display. What's really interesting is, of course, Gilead does both. It does those public executions that Donald was speaking about, but it also creates this internalized state of surveillance. So then the basic premise then is that Foucault worked on a Jeremy Bentham's, essentially Jeremy Bentham had a design for a new type of prison that he thought of really based on Russian prisons, where there is a central tower surrounded by cells. And in the central tower, there is the watchman. And so in the cells are prisoners or workers or children, because the building could be used for any type of institution, prisons, schools, hospitals. The tower then shines a bright light that is so light that the watchman is able to see everyone in the cells, but the people in the individual cells aren't able to see the watchman, and therefore they have to assume that they are always under observation. And Foucault says he is seen, but he does not see. This is the prisoner. He's an object of information, never a subject in communication. And the way that Gileadian power works, really, on this structural level, is by creating a state of internalized surveillance in its citizens, the fear that they are always being watched. And of course, it's probably worth mentioning that Bentham's original idea was a way of making prisons more humane, actually. He believed that it would lead to greater self-regulation of prisoners, because the jailer was visible to the public too, so it solved the problem of who guards the guard or who watches the watchman. But Foucault in 1975 drew on that basic premise to kind of illustrate the way that societies try to enact an internalized state of surveillance. It is not the fear of it's the fear of surveillance, not the act itself, which creates the systems of power and the systems of fear. And it encourages inmates to comply, to self-regulate, to self-police their behaviour. So yes, we've got a definition there if you wanted it. The idea that it's a kind of internal surveillance, and that's what we call panopticism, as that kind of abstract concept. The watcher ceases to be external to the watched. It creates this internal surveillance. And we see that in Gilead through the entire text, really. We've got 5 examples here. There could be eyes incognito, Offred says, and that fear that of course, eyes themselves are spies for the regime. And then we see the way in which being watched is a kind of motif that runs throughout the text, that is feared, but also oddly welcomed as well. So there are 124 explicit references to eyes in Handmaid's Tale. So that's when it is used to either describe people's eyes or to describe being watched. 124, which I think is a powerful kind of reference to use with students. And that's without the visual and auditory punning when you consider that Offred's first person narrative is a transcript. So every time she says I, we would be welcomed in hearing that I pronoun being heard as I, E-Y-E. So you get that kind of auditory punning. I think it's important as well to look back at the very first chapter and the amount of references to ovals, circles, hoops, garlands, wreaths, skirts, circular eye-like imagery, which I found really interesting in Elaine's talk about the spiral for women, and actually that women are so often historically associated with the symbol of the circle. And that acts as on two levels, one in terms of seeing women and the female body as roundness, as circular, as life-giving, all of those kind of connotations that already exist within women, but also the idea of the eye as a symbol of watching, of viewing. So this society then is subject to this panoptic surveillance. Of course, Offred and the other handmaids are not being watched 24/7. If they were, she would have been arrested very earlier and it would have been a novella rather than a novel. But she feels and fears that she might be. And it's that fear which creates the power structures in Gilead. That those around her might be disguised spies for the regime. The female body then in number 2 and 3 is a taboo fantasy for these men who aren't yet permitted to touch them. And playing the role of the prisoner in Foucault's reading of panoptic surveillance, the female body becomes something to control and police. And after teaching this concept of panopticism, so looking at the diagram of Bentham's original prison and how Foucault develops this to describe a state of internalized surveillance. One of my A-level students 3 years ago wrote this, and although it's not a developed analysis, it's an exemplification of constructing her ideas to read panopticism and to read Foucault through the Handmaid's Tale. So she says, through the lens of Foucauldian theory, Gilead can be viewed as an enactment of panoptic surveillance, as Offred states that the guards might be eyes incognito. And this suggests that the threat of discipline is so extreme that it pervades Offred's subconscious. Furthermore, the eyes themselves are symbolic of this never-ending cyclical process of surveillance. They see all and know all. And while this obviously cannot be the case, not all of Offred's subversive actions are being watched, the panoptic discipline of the eyes ensures that she feels it is the case. The physical and explicit confinement of barbed wire, cattle prods, guns, I talked about earlier in the presentation, have given way to an internalized psychological state of surveillance. And then we can think about how context can be led here, as Donna was speaking about. For Atwood writing in a post-McCarthy America, the threat of a watchful government was prominent. Gilead seems to be a progression of this dystopian and terrifying enactment of governmental power. And kind of, I'm thinking here as a practitioner, how I might then embed that understanding of the American plan here, that idea of an actual prison system that was constructed for women, and how that might be an even more enlightening contextual allusion to make here. So I could have looked at loads more specific instances of the female body as a locus of anxiety and fear, and in particular the kind of forced prostitution in Jezebel's, and the way in which motherhood is detached from generative function. And I think those who, and there's a really useful exercise to look at Adrian Rich's compulsory heterosexuality and lesbian existence. I'll pop it in the chat as well. I was talking about this to some of our A-level students, and they said, "Oh yeah, compet," and I didn't know that what had originally originated in 1970s feminist criticism has now been formed as a TikTok word to describe how women and men, but particularly women, are forced into this structure of compulsory heterosexuality. So that could be a really powerful thing to look at too. Ultimately, as we've said time and time again in these sessions, is that the true horror of Gilead lies in its plausibility. It's not an imagined universe, it's something that's happened already, and it's something that could very much happen again. And that the ways in which the female body is brutalised and exploited all have their precedence in some of the darkest chapters of world history. And I want to kind of leave on that image of, whilst Gilead focuses on the female body as a societal locus of fear and anxiety, it necessarily gives them power by exploring and by by understanding that the female body holds this power, whether that's through genital function, whether that's through communication, it necessarily gives Offred the tools through which to eventually rebel. Thank you for listening. I will just stop sharing now and hand back.
Go.
Well, good morning, folks, or good afternoon, and welcome to my contribution to this morning's celebration, really, of the Handmaid's Tale. And I'm delighted to have an opportunity to talk about a text which I have been a big admirer of since I first read it. And a bit like Kerry, I read this first as an undergrad, and that is of my own battered copy, which has survived all these years and travelled with me. And I've read it so many times because it's such a powerful narrative that it actually stands up to multiple rereadings, not just as a text that you teach in class, but as something that you can actually really connect to. And the working title of this presentation, when I was thinking about it, was Sure It's Just a Book. And I'm going to explain that in a moment because it sets up the framework for what I'm about to talk about. Now, I can't be the only person who's had these moments where you're talking about something and you're listening to yourself and you're kind of going, God, that's great. Listen to me. God, I'm fabulous. And somebody will inevitably puncture it with the comment, sure, it's just a book, miss. I said, get rid of that word just. The dichotomy of teaching English comes from the necessity to teach a text in such a way that you can enable them to fulfill the criteria of whatever exam board that you are answerable to. A lot of you are A-level teachers, some of us are leaving certificate higher level teachers, but also this desire to support them on their journey to become better thinkers and writers in general. To go, as I'd say, from collaboration to synthesis. So what the responses that they're creating are meaningful, they're engaged, and there's that other sort of element as well that you'd hope that they take something from the text that will journey with them as they move forward. So it's not just about putting the text on the table and dissecting it until no metaphor has been left unscathed, no symbol hasn't been kind of pinned to the board like a butterfly, but that you're going to actually look at the broader nuances of the text and allow them to figure out what they think and to write in a better way about it. Now, this is much more of a nuts and bolts kind of what I do in the classroom. I've been listening to all the speakers this morning and just really thoroughly enjoying that depth and breadth of knowledge that's out there. And it's obviously a text that has such meaning for a lot of us. I'm going back into what do you do when you're about to go into a classroom and teach this text? So it's perhaps a slightly different take on it. And I know I'm echoing some of the ideas that some of the others have had, but hopefully you'll take something from it that you might enjoy or that might resonate with you, or it may give you an idea to bring into your actual classroom. When I'm starting, no more than Donald, I start with quotes from Athwood herself. Now, she's a prolific interviewee and said there's a multiplicity of resources out there. So what I start with, and I said this is a selection for me, which allows myself and the students to engage in a discussion around the author's intent, which would be important for them to understand that it's a powerful narrative in its own right, but that there's an awful lot of complex ideas and topics being explored in parallel to the actual narrative. I don't say too much beyond kind of presenting these quotes to them initially and saying, what do you think that means? But what it allows me to do is that, as well as introduce the idea of authorial intent, it allows me to introduce this idea of genre, this idea of speculative fiction that we've spoken of so often. Because I think that having a context, a framework of understanding will allow students to have a deeper engagement with it. I mean, for example, if you're going to speak truth to power, make sure it's the truth. It's a fabulous quote within itself. I don't like pretty stories. I know that. That's my starting point. Now, I don't ask them. I ask them to keep a response journal as we're navigating through the text. And within this response journal, I'm not looking for them to write summaries because that's boring for a start for me. And I said, if you want a summary, you can go on to Lick Charts or Spark Notes, and the entire novel is summarized for you. What I'm interested in helping them to figure out is what's going on in the text, spotlighting certain moments, certain characters, obviously a deep dive on those, but to allow them to layer their own writing skills and their own understanding as we progress through the novel. There's a huge amount, a complexity of concepts that they need to understand to be able to kind of truly grapple with the depth of the novel. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, obviously, but it's an introduction to some of the terms and concepts that they need to kind of understand. And sometimes some of these words may be familiar to them, and some of them they may not understand at all, and some of them their understanding may not dovetail with yours. For example, the word feminism is such a weighted word. When I put up the word feminism the last time on the board, I mean, one of the boys just piped up, "Is this another man-bashing book, miss?" And I was like, "No, that's not what feminism is." And his response was, "Well, you could have fooled me." So sometimes you have to even challenge their own understanding of certain terms and certain words. Now, I don't put up the words and provide them with definitions, because that in itself is boring for me. And if it's boring for me, it's absolutely boring for them. So I like to try and take a process of discovery, where before we ever crack open the books of their shiny new books and break the spines on them, before we go through the doors of the gym for the very first time, we spend a little bit of time prepping and talking and thinking. Bear with me on this one. Sorry to cut off that wonderful tune, but I said a lot of the way that I teach sometimes involves bringing in outside resources, etc. I do play them. This is a Man's World by James Brown, and said this is a man's world, but it means nothing without a woman and a girl. And you ask them, what do you think that means? And it's interesting even getting them discussing these kind of ideas and that as a concept. One of the other things that we do in the response journal is I ask them at different times, I said, listen, if something catches your eye and reminds you of a song, make a note of it. Tell me why. Because it's a different layer of engagement. And it's a different way to kind of approach the text. And the more than Donald mentioned earlier, I love looking at the story of half-hanged Mary. And we do look at it. And I say, half-hanged Mary, half hung by the neck till she was half dead. How fabulous is that? It's suitably gruesome to catch the attention of even the most jaded of your students, but it also allows you to link into Puritanism, extremism, to the biblical justification, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Before I was not a witch, but now I am one. So you're already starting to link to some of those concepts that you need them to understand, and you're getting them to create their own understanding, their own explanations of these concepts. Something else that I do before we start reading it is we also have a little look at some, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, it's just some things I'm trying to put together for this morning. But there's a fabulous article, 10 religious verses used to justify terrible atrocities. Because again, as has been touched on by so many of the speakers this morning, the terror and the reality of the Handmaid's Tale is that it has its origins in things which have actually occurred. But it also has a connection to the world that we see around us. I mean, there was a question asked earlier, is the Handmaid's Tale still relevant? Absolutely. And when you ask them to look at these and you get them to get away from this idea of others, we don't do that. That's other people, other faith systems. And you say, well, actually, no, look around you. For example, in an Irish context, I don't have to go too far back at all to find examples of times when terrible things were done under the auspices of faith to predominantly women and children. We don't have to go too far into the past. We can look around us and find faith systems and extremists who will justify doing absolutely horrendous things on the most spurious of justifications. You're tapping into the zeitgeist when you start exploring the #MeToo, hashtag not all men, not all women. That's so current, so relatable. And if ever there's an age group who are still figuring out their own identities, their own ways of being in the world, who can connect to these experiences, that's a wonderful way for them to actually explore it. Also, the hypocrisy of those in power. We explored, for example, the televangelists. They find it amusing, and then when they think about it, they see the disturbing nature of the abuses of power that are perpetrated by people who essentially are doing things for our own good. So you're then reinforcing those ideas about indoctrination, extremism. You're looking at feminism, you're looking at gender, you're looking at culture. But they're organically working towards an understanding of these terms and these concepts, which will allow you then to establish these ideas and to draw upon these threads as you navigate through the novel. There's a wonderful article or a video there that, again, you can click on and play at your own time later, from Atwood herself, talking about how the Handmaid's Tale was received 35 years ago, and it's been referenced already about Reaganomics and environmentalism and the rise of second wave feminism, to how it's perceived now. And through that, through the discussion that arises from that, you're then linking in to other kind of concepts which will enable them to have a deeper understanding of the text itself. If that's not enough, as I've said to some people, you'll still have some people who perhaps need a little bit more context. I link it into the actual reality of the world we see around us in actual facts. For example, there's only 6 countries in the world who give men and women equal legal working rights. And I might as well tell you, I'm not living in one. And that it's not enshrined in law. And I think you'll be surprised to find where it is enshrined in law, that there are rapists who have parental rights in multiple countries. That sparks discussion, and you can see yourself the threads it'll link to when they take the children, when they steal those children in many ways in the Handmaid's Tale. When you look at the horror that is the ceremony, and you start them asking questions about parent-child relationships, about how we treat people, how we allow the law or the rule of law sometimes to discriminate against those who are perceived to be other. And then you start to kind of broaden it out into concepts such as this, that you allow them to look at a world in which it's not just women who suffer. Because this is one of the ideas that we explore a lot in the text when we're working through it. Because I said, you have to get away, or I found that I had to get away from this idea that somehow feminism meant that, it was all men are bad. I said, look, this novel allows us to see what happens. It's not just about feminism, it's about what happens when you have a big brother state, when you have totalitarianism. It shows what happens when you allow othering. It shows what happens when you have when the abjuration of the intellect is absolutely perpetrated by the ruling classes. And I know people have mentioned, as I have, the state-sanctioned rape, the hypocrisy. It shows what happens when language becomes corrupted. Better for some never means better for all, says Alfred. And that's so true, or says the commander really to Alfred, rather. And in that, you're then connecting these concepts to the language, to the ideas as you're actually reading through it. The engagement with the text is enhanced, therefore, by having this little bit of prep time, by spending these classes looking at the overall concepts and the real life examples. Now, this is sort of a bookend approach to the entire thing, in that that's what I've done to prep it. I do quite a bit. As I said, I do spend some time in advance of actually reading the text, and then obviously we're reading through the text and you're doing your deep dive and your retrieval work and your discussion, and it's an ongoing evolution of their own thoughts and their own development. What is interesting, therefore, is taking what they get out of it. I asked them at the end, I said, we've done a number of tasks at the end before we go into full-length essay writing, etc., to reflect upon their own engagement with it. And we asked, when asked, did they think that their gender impacted their reading of the text, the girls overwhelmingly said yes, and the boys not so much. They did pick up on something that has been addressed earlier this morning, that women are equally oppressive, they felt, betraying each other. It's an illustration of the dangers of fundamentalism, and all should object to anyone being treated this way. I'm still looking at one of these statements, one of these comments, and reflecting upon it. It's insulting to insinuate that it will impact a woman more to lose a child than a man. You may find that this comment sticks because it touches on what I might, and it's not so unconscious anymore, a bias I myself would have held. I'm still reading that comment and still thinking about it. And the joy about teaching, especially when you're teaching a text like the Handmaid's Tale, is that no one reading of it is absolute. But when you go back to this idea of collaboration to synthesis, when you're looking for them to create their own meaningful responses, this is the type of statement that asks you as an individual to think about your own response to it and to direct discussion from it. The statements that are here, I would take in a second next time I teach it and bring some of these back to the next group and say, what do you think? Now, what we did as well with this is we, if somebody was happy for me to share the statement with the group, we shared it and we discussed it, and otherwise, and I said, and sometimes I said, well, there would have been a serious debate around some of these ideas. For example, the men in Gilead remind me of people I know, said one student, rather depressingly. And moving on to they're all a bit like that deep down, said one. But you take these ideas, and that's their responses, but they textually support these observations. And in doing that, they're bringing an answer that is unique to the individual, that is textually based, academically built up, supported by connecting back to the concepts and the themes and the narrative, but that isn't a mere regurgitation of notes or my ideas or my interpretation. Also connecting back to something that was mentioned earlier was, as we went through the novel, in the response journal, I asked them to make connections to real life. Where could they find relevance? What could they see around them? And at the end, I compiled the entire list. Now, this is frozen at one moment in time from the moment I compiled this list. So it reflects a particular, this time last year, really. And we had, for example, you can see yourself, we're just over, and it was on the other day that you had the anniversary of the storming of the White House. They came back to me after seeing that on the news, or on their news feed probably, as opposed to the news in the old school way I watch it, and said, oh my God, miss, did you see that? It's like the sons of Jacob. And I said, you're right. And I said, there you go. Speculative fiction, but with a strange prescience for the world around us. They looked at and they found a lot of historical antecedents which connected to the speculative fiction. They saw relevant in the things that were happening around them. You can see yourself, they even introduced things like, or identify things like weaponized sexism, fertility rights, state-sanctioned atrocities. I had a number of historical scholars. There were equally, there were higher level English students, but also higher level history students. And they connected it back to some of the atrocities that had happened during World War II. They'd also found the Stasi and the Capos. So they found a huge amount of relevance, both historically and contemporary, to connect to the Handmaid's Tale. And that layer of engagement and depth also supports their development as thinkers and writers. I would love to claim that that list is exactly finished now, that we'll never add to it, we'll never update it, but I'm sure as you're looking at it, you can see so many ideas and things which have occurred. The Taliban, for example, seizing power and systematically eroding girls' and women's rights has occurred since I compiled that list. And again, I ran into one of my students who's now gone on to third level, and they said they were thinking about the Handmaid's Tale when this was breaking on the news. And I thought, there, That's one of the things that you want them to take with them, that they'll actually see stuff happening around them and say, I can see a connection. This has happened before. This is still happening. And again, I've always felt that when you can show the relevance of a text or find something that they'll make a meaningful kind of engagement with, it adds a nuance. It makes each answer unique to the student who's writing it. As I said, no two people ever read the same book. I go back to her statements when we're getting ready to go to that final moment, and we look at them again. And I ask them, with the knowledge and having completed the journey of reading through the text, I ask them to write now on their understanding of these quotes, to write now what they understand by the idea of nothing makes me more nervous than people to say it can't happen here. You're connecting that back to the exploration of the religious verses that have been used to justify atrocities. Men are afraid that women will laugh at them. Women are afraid that men will kill them. And you ask them to reflect upon this and why women aren't safe, where the precedence is established in the novel, and how they can see the connection to the writing that they're doing, and the evolution in their understanding and the depth of their discussion based on reading The Handmaid's Tale, having done the prep work, having built up the layer of responses in the response journal, means that the very simplistic responses that you get at the start by introducing this to what they're writing at this stage of the process, it's a huge journey. It's a massive step forward in them for them to kind of engage in writing in a meaningful way. And you go back to this kind of idea of fundamentalism, of extremism, of a society which allows a certain few to dictate the negative outcomes for so many people. And it opens up the vista to so many other explorations and ideas. The other thing, the other benefit I found in doing this is that it spills over to their writing for paper one, in that building up a nuanced response is a worthwhile trajectory of time for us. Ashwood says that in the end, we'll all become stories. She also said that nobody's heart is perfect. And I've always liked that as an idea in itself. But in that exploration, for a short period of time, while we're the main characters in our own stories, we're support characters, we're minor characters for our students. But in sharing a text and discussing it, such as The Handmaid's Tale, which is such a fabulous piece of work, I like to think that will linger on, that will not be written out as they move on to third level, that at occasional moments as their story progresses will reappear as these supporting characters who opened their eyes to a world that is beyond social media, hashtag right now, Instagram, duck faces, the lot, will become part of their story through the process of teaching such a powerful text as The Handmaid's Tale. Now I realise that so many of the ideas and concepts which have been explored this morning, they're fabulous. I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to it. And this was much more of a nuts and bolt type of what to do, a bookend, if you wish, to what we do before, what I do at the end. But I can recommend it as an effective method of engaging them, meaningful writing, a dialogue which opens the floor for discussions which can frequently go down the rabbit hole of other ideas. But isn't that the joy of teaching English? That joy of supporting discovery and learning. I often say we are jack of all trades English teachers. We're theologians, historians, sociologists, psychologists, wordsmiths, and we're all become part of a larger tapestry of stories. But that has been my experience of working with the Handmaid's Tale and teaching higher level English students. And at the very end, no one's going out that door after going through this process saying it's just a book. It is a book and so much more. Thank you very much.